Imagine riding your horse at absolute Mach speed to stop an illegal baby baptism, fully expecting to fight a literal demon, only to find a dude who looks like a K-pop idol, flawlessly channeling divine holy energy. Our new redheaded priestess Roberta is completely losing her mind because this random layman is performing a sacred ritual reserved only for high-tier priests, and he's doing it with the ease of someone making a morning iced coffee. We start in a northern tundra where winter basically never ends, and meet this guy Ulrich, who apparently does not age or die. His mentor, an elderly woman named Hild, asks him a pretty heavy question: is living forever actually just a massive, painful drag? And honestly, she's not wrong. Even the immortal elves eventually bite the dust, and the ancient dragons are literally just skeletons floating in the void at this point. Ulrich admits that, yeah, watching everyone you love turn to dust is painful, but because humans are mortal, memories fade and the agony eventually turns into longing. Hild smiles, wondering if she'll just be another faded memory to him one day, and he frankly tells her, yeah, probably. Which is a brutal reality check, but she actually prefers the honesty over some fake sweet talk. She holds his hands and asks for one final favor before she dies. She wants him to take her title as Lord of Dithmarschen, rule the land, protect its people, and keep her memory alive in his mind for as long as he possibly can. But despite her final wish, Ulrich knows the absolute law of the universe: human memories are absolute garbage. A day will come when even her face is a complete blur. Yet, his long, unending life must continue anyway. Fast forward to her grave, where his servant calls out to him. The servant warns him that the air is freezing and he should head inside, and Ulrich knows he has to keep moving forward. Even if every new relationship he makes is destined to end in a funeral, he hopes the journey won't be entirely filled with suffering. Talk about a depressing starter pack. Now we jump to the present day in Dithmarschen. A place so ridiculously cold that summer is basically a myth and monsters roam free. This is where our story actually kicks off, with Father Alonso drinking tea and casually telling his adopted daughter Roberta that he's sending her there. She literally spits her tea out in pure shock like a cartoon character. Alonso explains that the previous head priest of Dithmarschen vanished into thin air, and now the Pope needs a replacement immediately. Roberta puts her cup down and tries to find a logical explanation for this madness, asking why he's recommending a rookie like her who was ordained only 2 years ago. She argues that they should be launching a search party for the missing priest first, but Alonso literally dismisses the guy's disappearance like he lost a cheap pencil. He tells her to shut up and pack her bags, claiming the Pope wants this done. Roberta thinks this entire situation smells incredibly fishy. It's obvious Alonso has already made up his mind, and this conversation is just a courtesy. She facepalms hard, wondering why she always gets the worst assignments. Alonso tries to soften the blow by telling her she reminds him of his younger self, which makes her pull a face that is absolute meme gold. He sits back, getting all nostalgic, reminding her how he adopted her when she was abandoned, and even ordained her himself. Since they've spent so many years together, it's only natural they'd be alike. He mentions that he actually did a great job when he was the head priest there, and he has no doubt she will do the same. Roberta grew up on his wild adventure stories, but realized she had never once heard him talk about his time in Dithmarschen. She rides out on her horse, deeply suspicious of what secrets he's hiding there. But since she's already on the way, she decides she'll just uncover the truth herself. Suddenly, a massive spear blocks her path. A guard stops her, demanding to know where she came from. Roberta shows off the glowing seal of Ganymede on her hand, introducing herself as a priestess. Suddenly, this absolute unit of a man walks up, towering over her. Even on her horse, she is literally eye level with this guy. She's convinced he's got giant blood. The giant asks what her relationship is to Father Alonso, and when she says Alonso raised her, the guy's face completely lights up. He kisses her hand, introducing himself as Bern, a loyal servant of the local lord. Bern gets nostalgic, mentioning Alonso was barely 30 when he served here, but when Roberta asks to see the lord, Bern tells her he's currently out of the castle. Roberta is instantly on guard. She remembers the rumors from the records about this mysterious lord, who apparently succeeded Hild and has ruled for over 300 years, looking completely young. She asks what he's doing, and Bern casually says he's performing an infant sacrament. Roberta is stunned. She asks if there's another priest in the area, and Bern says nope, which means the Lord himself is presiding over the holy ritual. Roberta is absolutely horrified. An unordained layman performing a divine ritual? She tells Bern that the infant sacrament is a big deal, and having a non-priest do it is insane. If the ritual fails, an evil spirit could literally claim and possess the newborn baby. She can't understand why the locals are so incredibly chill about this massive danger. Furious, she grabs the reins of her horse, demanding to know his location so she can stop this disaster immediately. She gallops through the nomadic tents under the setting sun. She's looking everywhere, praying she's not too late. She leaps off her horse, ready to crash the party, fearing she'll find a possessed child, but when she pushes through the crowd, she sees the baby is completely fine. She looks around in confusion, searching for this supposed fake priest, asking a local woman where the Lord is. The woman points right ahead. So, standing in the sunset, he introduces himself as Ulrich, the Lord of Dithmarschen. Roberta analyzes him. He's standing in direct sunlight, so he's not a vampire, and he's too tall to be a dwarf. But keeping this level of youth at his age should be flat out impossible. Ulrich tells her he was expecting her, but didn't think she'd ride up so fast. He notices she's shivering and invites her inside his yurt for some hot tea. They head inside this cozy, traditional nomadic tent. An old servant pours her a bowl of dark, steaming liquid. Ulrich asks if the strong scent is okay with her, calling her by her name. Roberta flinches, shocked that he even knows who she is. Ulrich smiles, explaining that he and Father Alonso keep in touch, and Alonso warned him he was sending her. Roberta sniffs the bowl, suspicious, and asks what kind of tea this is. He calls it Manhwa tea. She takes a sip, noting that the Manhwa tea she knows doesn't smell like this at all. Immediately, she starts choking and spitting it out because it tastes like literal poison. Ulrich calmly explains it's gathered from mutant pine trees. See, everything in Dithmarschen grows under the corrupting influence of the demon realm, so even normal plants are slightly mutated. He dryly tells her she can't afford to be a picky eater out here. Roberta notes that the weather doesn't seem as brutally barren as she expected. Ulrich's face goes serious. He mentions the temperature has been rising weirdly, regardless of the season. He suggests it might mean the Little Ice Age is finally coming to an end. He asks if she knows how historical eras are commonly divided. She says yes. The rise and fall of an empire is counted as one era. Right now, humanity is living in the third era, meaning two massive empires have already fallen. Ulrich explains that the Little Ice Age began near the collapse of the Second Empire. He says the elves, and he took to calling it that to distinguish it from the true ancient Ice Age. Roberta's brain short-circuits. The Second Empire fell over 1,400 years ago, yet this man is talking about it like he was literally there hanging out with the elves. Ulrich looks at her reflection in his tea bowl, asking if she's desperately wondering who the hell he actually is. She goes quiet, then asks what Alonso told him about him. Ulrich says Alonso told her nothing, but she knows the rumors claim he's a half-elf who lived for 300 years. Ulrich mutters to himself, realizing 300 years have already flown by. Then, he looks her dead in the eyes and drops a massive truth bomb. He is not a half-blood. He is purely human. Roberta is extremely skeptical, thinking it's much easier to believe he's a slow-aging half-elf than a 300-year-old pure human. Ulrich sets his cup down, telling her there is absolutely no lie in his words, but he won't force her to believe him. He advises her not to overthink things and just let the answers reveal themselves over time. Before they can dive deeper, they hear shuffling outside. Two adorable local kids peek their heads through the door of the yurt. Ulrich decides to end their chat there, noting that the rest of his people are waiting for him. He gets up, telling her he'll finish up the infant sacrament today, but she will take over from tomorrow. He looks back with a charming smile, saying he looks forward to working with her. As he steps out, the narration notes that the dream of immortality has always haunted every era. It is the arrogant desire of mortals to reach the level of gods. But most mortals are just grateful to exist and protect what they hold dear. The local families bow deeply to Ulrich, expressing their immense gratitude for his blessing. Roberta realizes the infant sacrament here is way more than just a religious checkmark. It signifies the baby survived this harsh land. Still, she grumbles to herself about how chaotic and disorganized their holy etiquette is. Suddenly, an extremely old bald man with a long white beard offers her a cup of wine. Roberta politely thanks him, though she's secretly terrified it'll taste like that mutated pine tree tea. She takes a massive gulp anyway, hoping it will at least keep her from freezing to death. Her eyes light up. It is insanely delicious. The old man chuckles, revealing this wine has been aged for 60 years. He tells her it was actually a personal gift from Lord Ulrich back when he was just a little kid. He tells her a story of how he went hunting with his father and uncle as a boy, but they were attacked by a monster. The adults were badly injured trying to shield him, but he managed to drag them onto a sled and run like hell. Ulrich found them, praised the boy's incredible courage, and gifted him this precious bottle of wine. But as the kid held the bottle, a profound thought struck him. He wanted to drink this meaningful wine at the very end of his life, so he entrusted it back to Ulrich for safekeeping. And today, exactly 60 years later, as an old man close to his final breath, Ulrich finally returned the bottle to him. The old man looks at Roberta, acknowledging that she must find the Lord highly suspicious and bizarre. But he explains that for the people of this land, from the day they receive their first baby blessing to the day they take their very last breath, they live under the warm, unchanging gaze of that one man. He asks Roberta to please look at Ulrich with an open mind, because to them, he is their eternal guardian. Roberta stares into her cup, deeply touched by the story. She sighs, her mind completely overloaded with things she can't comprehend. She looks at the locals dancing around the campfire, wondering if Father Alonso felt this exact same confusion on his first day. She looks up at the starry night sky, completely upside down in her deep thoughts. She wonders if time will eventually bring her the answers she seeks, and what her purpose even is here. She stares at Ulrich standing by the fire, his true identity still shrouded in mystery. Later that night, the heavy wooden doors of the temple creak open. An old man steps inside, begging Lord Ulrich for his help regarding a bizarre curse. Roberta overhears them from the shadows, instantly alert. A curse? The father reveals that the hooded child standing next to him should actually be a fully grown adult with kids of his own. Suddenly, the kid's hood slips back, and his eye flashes a terrifying glowing yellow slit pupil. The father desperately explains that ever since his son returned from the dead, everything about him has completely changed. Talk about a cliffhanger. What kind of monster is hiding under that hood, and can Ulrich actually save him? We'll find out in the next video. We start with a clean white page, a steady hand, and a feather pen. Roberta is writing a letter back home to Father Alonso, trying to summarize the absolute circus she has been dealing with for the past week. Apparently, her predecessor did a runner and left the parish in complete shambles, meaning she had to immediately hire a bunch of rookie acolytes just to clear the backlog of sacred rituals. But her real problem isn't the paperwork. It is our guy Ulrich, who has zero respect for proper divine etiquette. She is cornering him in the cathedral, demanding to know why he did not even bother to prepare basic incense or holy oils for the last ritual. His response is just a flat, "Why should I?" Roberta looks like she's about to pop a blood vessel. She points at the massive stained glass window behind them, reminding him that this is literally the basic protocol for honoring Lord Hestio. Now, if you are not caught up on the celestial family tree of this world, Hestio was a mortal who got adopted by the goddess Ganymede. He looked down from the heavens, saw humans shivering in the cold, felt bad for them, and brought them fire. Standard Prometheus behavior. Naturally, humans started treating him like a god, lighting fires and blowing them out to create holy smoke in his name. But Ulrich just sighs and tells her that the whole honoring thing is a total translation error. He holds up a single candle, looking incredibly bored as Roberta watches him like he's speaking a foreign language. He explains that extinguishing the flame isn't some deep symbolic gesture. It was actually a direct summon. See, back in the day, whenever the fire went out, Hestio would literally slide down from the clouds to relight it himself, because he didn't want the mortals struggling with flint and steel. The mortals, being slightly slow on the uptake, assumed he just really loved the smoke. Roberta is staring at him, completely stunned by this incredibly specific divine trivia, and asks him if he casually met Hestio himself. Ulrich just waves it off, setting the candle down on the altar with a quiet clack. He tells her the gods never actually wrote down any of these ridiculous rules, so she is basically just doing performance art at this point. And then he drops a minor truth bomb, casually mentioning that he told Father Alonso the exact same thing years ago. Roberta's brain completely short-circuits. Alonso never mentioned a single word of this to her. Ulrich just looks out the window, muttering about how some things are simply inevitable. He says they are living in a land of the one-eyed, which is just a very poetic way of saying everyone around here is operating on half-truths and blind faith. We cut back to Roberta's letter. She admits to Alonso that she isn't exactly the most devout priestess in the world, but her pen is literally tearing through the paper because even she has the common decency to follow the rules without trying to reinvent theology every single Tuesday. She writes that it is an absolute miracle nobody has reported Ulrich to the High Inquisitors for blatant heresy yet, and to make things worse, whenever she tries to dig into his past, she just gets bombarded with wild folk legends from the locals. Like this guy who is happily carrying his kid, claiming Ulrich once soloed a giant and casually visited a sleeping dragon for weekend tea. Even the local ladies talk about him like he's some kind of high society gentleman who just happened to drop out of a romance novel. The chibi art really highlights her pain here. The villagers are basically running a full-time Ulrich fan club, which makes Roberta feel like the only sane person in a town that has been completely brainwashed. She realizes she is stuck in this frozen wasteland for the next 10 years, wondering if she will lose her mind before her contract is up. She folds the letter, seals it, and decides to stretch her legs in the dark corridors of the manor. And here is the absolute peak of her discomfort. The church's actual rectory was in such horrific condition, full of broken floorboards and giant spiderwebs, that she had no choice but to move into Ulrich's private mansion. She knows he did it out of basic hospitality, but to her, it feels like a high-tension roommate agreement with a suspicious ageless landlord. But just as she is about to turn the corner, she hears footsteps. It is the old traveler we saw earlier, leaning heavily on a cane, slowly guiding a hooded, silent child through the dim hallway. Roberta peeks from behind a stone pillar, wondering who on earth would travel to this remote northern frontier in the middle of a brutal winter. She watches them follow the dark-skinned guardian Bern and realizes they are heading directly toward Ulrich's private study. Inside the office, Ulrich is standing by his desk, looking down at a basket of fresh red apples as the heavy wooden door creaks open. The old man steps inside, bowing his head respectfully before the young lord. He says he traveled a massive distance because he heard rumors of a lord who has bypassed the natural human lifespan, a man bordering on true immortality. Ulrich's expression immediately goes cold. The casual warmth is entirely gone from his face. Outside the half-open door, Roberta is holding her breath, her shadow stretching across the stone floor as she listens in. She realizes she is about to hear the one thing she has been desperately trying to figure out. But the old man surprises them both. He says he did not travel all this way just to steal the secret of eternal youth. He gently reaches out, pulling back the heavy woolen hood of the silent child standing beside him. He introduces himself as Rashid from the distant kingdom of Ulrich and says he needs help with his son's terrifying curse. Roberta's eyes widen in the dark hallway. A curse. Ulrich kneels down to look the kid in the eye. Rashid explains that he is 67 years old, and he fathered this boy when he was a young man of 21. Do the math. The child standing before them should be a 46-year-old man with a family of his own. But as Rashid's voice begins to tremble, we see a dark, shadowy memory of a mother desperately cradling her pale, lifeless child. Rashid says everything changed the moment his boy miraculously returned from the dead. Ulrich looks up, his gaze narrowing. He asks for confirmation. Your child actually died and then just woke up? Rashid nods, his eyes filled with a 30-year-old grief that has never fully healed. He says it was a stupid, sudden accident. The boy slipped and drowned in a cold mountain stream. He and his wife found the body, confirmed there was no breath left in him, and held a proper funeral. They buried him deep in the earth, but only a few days later, horrific screams started echoing from beneath the graveyard dirt. They frantically tore the grave open, shattered the wooden coffin, and found the boy crying inside, alive, but completely altered. From that horrific night onward, the child simply stopped growing. His mind completely shattered, regressing to the state of a feral infant, remembering absolutely nothing except the face of his father. Rashid explains that in their culture, they bury the dead fully intact so their spirits can cross over to the earth safely. But his son was rejected by the gods, trapped in this bizarre, unchanging limbo. He says the boy was cursed because he insulted a divine altar when he was 8. But Ulrich immediately cuts him off with a chilling deadpan. Stop lying. Ulrich steps closer, placing a hand on the boy's head. He notes that Ulrich is a massive desert kingdom thousands of miles to the east. There is absolutely no way some random nomadic father heard rumors about a secret immortal lord in Dithmarschen unless he was actively searching for something highly specific. He tells Rashid that regular curses are handled by local priests or mages or even high-tier alchemists. And if every single one of those experts failed to fix this child over 3 decades, then this is not a curse. Roberta watches through the crack in the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. Ulrich stands over the old man, his shadow completely swallowing him as he asks, "What did you actually do to this boy?" Rashid's face goes completely pale as we plunge into a flashback from 30 years ago. We are in a dusty, sun-baked eastern city. Siege ladders are resting against high stone walls, and soldiers are clashing in a brutal, bloody assault. The heavy wooden gates are shattered open with a massive impact. A younger, heavily armed Rashid is leading the charge, his face splattered with blood as he yells at his men to push through the breach. Another mercenary rides up beside him, shouting his name over the chaotic noise of battle. He tells Rashid that the commander just issued a highly specific side mission. They need to infiltrate the inner palace and capture an old man. Rashid asks who this target is, looking completely exhausted and dirty from the siege. The mercenary replies that he doesn't know the full details, but the old man is reportedly an elite alchemist who spent his entire life researching the secrets of true immortality. The memory continues, the sky a burning orange as the military assault tears through the outer defenses. The heavy inner gates of the palace are forced open, splintering under the pressure. Rashid and his squad of mercenaries surge into the royal courtyards, clearing the remaining guards. His squad mate calls out to him again, pointing toward the private chambers of the royal family. The order is completely clear. Find the old alchemist and bring him back alive. Rashid is moving fast, his sword drawn, his mind focused entirely on the massive payout of this high-value target. We see a glimpse of a glowing, bubbling green liquid inside a glass tube, the legendary formula of youth. Rashid kicks open the doors to a gorgeous, sunlit courtyard filled with white stone pillars and exotic palm trees. The palace corridors are completely silent, abandoned by the servants who fled the slaughter outside. His heavy leather boots clack against the polished tile floor as he searches room after room. He enters a private laboratory, his eyes scanning the shelves of ancient scrolls and mystical ingredients. In the center of the room, a massive iron cauldron is boiling over a roaring fireplace, thick green fumes rising into the air. It looks like whoever was working here left in a massive hurry, leaving the fires burning and the experiments completely active. Rashid walks over to a wooden workbench where a single glass vial is suspended over an oil lamp. Inside the vial is a thick, glowing orange fluid that seems to radiate a strange, warm light. Rashid is completely mesmerized by it, but before he can touch it, a young man in a purple cloak bursts into the room, screaming at him to keep his dirty hands off the sacred formula. Rashid instantly spins around, his mercenary instincts kicking in as he swings his heavy blade. The young alchemist raises his hand, a brilliant, blinding blue light gathering in his palm as he channels high-tier mana. The shockwave of pure energy explodes through the room, shattering the wooden pillars and sending stone debris flying everywhere. Rashid is blown backward, crashing hard through a wooden table, coughing violently as thick gray dust fills the air. The alchemist stands in the rubble, his eyes wide with a manic, terrifying panic. He isn't looking at Rashid. He is looking at the floor where the glass vial has slipped off the desk. He drops to his knees, letting out a horrific shriek of pure despair as the glass shatters against the stone. He frantically tries to scoop up the glowing red liquid with his bare fingers, babbling about how his precious century-long work is completely ruined. He is completely distracted, weeping over the spilled fluid like a madman. Rashid doesn't hesitate. He rises from the rubble, grips his sword with both hands, and drives the steel blade directly through the alchemist's back. The alchemist gasps, blood spilling from his lips as he grips the sharp edge of the blade penetrating his chest. Rashid pulls the sword free with a brutal twist, sending a spray of dark blood across the stone floor. The alchemist stumbles backward, clutching his chest, his body collapsing right next to the roaring fireplace. His robes instantly catch fire, the bright orange flames spreading across his fabric in a matter of seconds. He lets out one final, agonizing scream as the fire completely swallows his body, transforming him into a burning silhouette of ash and smoke. Rashid stands there, the heat of the fire reflecting in his eyes as a massive realization hits him. The young man he just slaughtered wasn't some royal prince, he was the actual alchemist. A few minutes later, his squad mate walks in, looking at the charred, unrecognizable corpse on the floor. He asks why Rashid killed the target when the boss explicitly wanted him alive. Rashid says the guy attacked him with high-tier magic. His buddy sighs, noting that the alchemist must have successfully slowed his own physical aging to look so young. He wonders if the old man was actually close to achieving true, flawless immortality before Rashid ended him. But then his buddy's expression goes serious. He tells Rashid that history is full of absolute fools who tried to bypass death, and every single one of them met a horrific, miserable end, just like the blackened mummy lying in the ashes. He tells Rashid to forget about it, claiming the commander will get over the disappointment soon enough. But as they walk out of the burning laboratory, Rashid quietly slips his hand into his leather pouch. He couldn't bring himself to discard the last remaining intact vial of the alchemist's incomplete elixir. Roberta, watching from the door, looks completely horrified by this reveal. Back in the present, Rashid looks down at his scarred hands, admitting he didn't keep the potion out of some grand desire to live forever. He just wanted to sell it to some wealthy noble for a massive fortune. But then, his only son drowned in that mountain stream. We see a heartbreaking memory of Rashid cradling his cold, lifeless boy, his face covered in tears as he pulls the glowing red vial from his cloak. He was completely blinded by grief, willing to do absolutely anything to bring his child back. He forced the glowing red elixir down the dead boy's throat, desperately praying for a miracle. But nothing happened. The body remained cold. Heartbroken, they buried him, only for those terrifying screams to start echoing from the grave 3 days later. Rashid looks up at Ulrich, his voice barely a whisper. He says he and his wife spent the next 30 years trying to care for what came out of that dirt. But right before his wife passed away from old age, she looked at the boy and told Rashid the most painful truth of his life. We see a close-up of the boy's eye. It is a solid, glowing amber color with a sharp, reptilian slit pupil. He is savagely tearing into a raw apple, his mouth covered in dark blood-like juice. His wife realized that whatever returned from that grave, it was not their son. In the present, the boy quietly drops to all fours, his gaze locked onto the basket of apples near Ulrich's desk. Rashid tries to grab him by the collar, yelling at him to behave, but the boy snaps. He lets out a feral, guttural hiss that makes Roberta gasp in horror from the doorway. He bites down on Rashid's hand with terrifying force, his sharp fangs sinking deep into the old man's flesh. The apples spill from the basket, rolling across the stone floor with a soft sound. The boy ignores his father's pain, crawling on his belly like a wild beast, grabbing the fallen fruit and devouring it with savage, desperate hunger. Ulrich stands over them, his expression incredibly soft but heavy with a quiet, tragic wisdom. He says he can barely imagine the absolute hell Rashid has endured to bring this thing across the continent. We see a pale, spectral image of the boy looking like a hollow, watery ghost trapped inside a physical shell. Ulrich gently reaches down, wrapping a clean white bandage around Rashid's bleeding hand. He looks the old man in the eye and asks, "Do you truly, in your heart, believe this thing is still your child?" Rashid looks up, tears streaming down his wrinkled face. He says even if he behaves like a monster, he still carries the exact face of his sweet boy. How could any parent turn their back on that? Ulrich finishes tying the knot on the bandage, his grip firm and steady. He looks down at the crawling creature and says, "What a tragedy! But your wife was entirely correct. This is not your son. It was never actually alive to begin with." Rashid's eyes widen in absolute terror, his voice cracking as he asks what Ulrich means. Ulrich's gaze goes completely dark. He says there is only one path left to resolve this 30-year mistake. With a swift, silent motion, Ulrich draws a sharp silver dagger from his belt, the polished steel catching the dim light of the study. Roberta's face goes completely pale. She throws the door open, screaming at him to stop, but Ulrich is already moving, his heavy footsteps silent as he steps behind the crouching boy. He raises the gleaming blade high above his head, his face hidden in deep shadow, looking like a cold, merciless executioner. The boy is completely oblivious, his sharp fangs tearing another massive chunk out of the red apple. Roberta lunges into the room, her hand outstretched, her voice echoing off the stone walls in a desperate plea. But before the blade can fall, Rashid throws his entire frail body forward, slamming into Ulrich's chest. The struggle is chaotic and fast. Thick, dark blood splatters across the clean stone tiles of the office floor. Rashid is gripping Ulrich's wrist with all his remaining strength, his teeth bared in a desperate, suicidal effort to protect the monster he loves, while Ulrich looks down at him with a chilling, silent gaze. Roberta bursts through the heavy wooden doors, her face twisted in absolute horror. She is too late to stop the momentum. Rashid has already driven his hidden blade straight into Ulrich's chest. The sound of coughing blood echoes through the small stone room. Rashid grips the handle of his weapon, his expression a mix of desperate rage and panic. Ulrich stands completely still, blood dripping from his lips, his gaze calm and unnervingly quiet. He tells Rashid that he expected exactly this kind of underhanded combat training from a veteran soldier of Ararik. Rashid's voice trembles as he mutters an apology, claiming he simply had no other choice. Ulrich's body begins to tilt, his energy fading as he starts to slide toward the stone floor. Roberta scrambles forward, her boots scraping loudly against the tile. Rashid turns his head sharply, realizing the young priestess has witnessed the entire assassination attempt. His eyes go completely dark. He knows he cannot afford to let any church witnesses leave this room alive. He swings his sword in a wide, blood-slicked arc, driving the steel directly at Roberta's neck. The blade reflects the cold light of the room as it rushes toward her throat. But Roberta is not some fragile lady-in-waiting who collapses at the first sign of danger. She pulls a short dagger from her habit, parrying the heavy sword with a sharp metallic clash that sends vibrations up her arm. Rashid stumbles back, clutching his chest as his old wounds flare up from the sudden exertion. But the danger isn't over. The fanged child drops his half-eaten apple, his eyes locking onto Roberta. Roberta kneels beside Ulrich's motionless body, desperately asking if he is still breathing. She begins to gather holy mana in her palms, intending to cast her most powerful healing magic. Suddenly, the fanged kid leaps through the air like a rabid animal, his fingers clawing at her face. Roberta swerves, swinging her dagger in a defensive arc to keep the creature back, but a firm hand suddenly catches her wrist mid-swing, stopping her cold. It is Ulrich. He is looking up at her, blood still smeared across his jaw. Roberta's mind is racing, completely unable to process how a man with a pierced lung is still holding on to her. The boy lets out a high-pitched primal hiss, his jaw opening wide to reveal row after row of needle-thin fangs. He dives forward again, bypassing Roberta entirely. Rashid can only watch in absolute silence from the corner of the room. The creature sinks its teeth directly into Ulrich's exposed neck, tearing the flesh open. Blood sprays across Roberta's face, the warm fluid making her freeze in absolute terror. The creature is literally tearing Ulrich's throat to shreds, the sound of tearing muscle filling the silent study. But Ulrich's eyes remain open, staring directly into the ceiling with a cold, detached focus. He tells Roberta, voice completely steady despite the trauma, that this creature is nothing more than a hollow, mindless vessel. He commands her to stand her ground and use her power. The boy pulls back, his mouth dripping with blood, looking completely feral. Roberta grips her dagger, her fear finally transforming into a sharp, focused determination. She lunges forward, her blade cutting through the air. She calls upon the name of Ganymede, channeling her holy mana directly into the steel of her weapon. She slashes downward, severing the creature's arm in a single, clean strike. The holy light of her spell flares, illuminating the dark corners of the office. But there is no blood. Instead, a cluster of thick, writhing red plant vines erupts from the boy's severed shoulder. Roberta's eyes widen as she realizes those pulsing, vascular vines are the actual structure filling the child's skin. The impact of her strike sends the creature tumbling backward across the floor. Roberta stands over it, her breathing heavy, her dagger dripping with a strange, dark sap. She yells at the monster, demanding to know how it dared to wear the face of a human child. She turns to Rashid, telling him to look closely at the true, horrific nature of the thing he spent 30 years protecting. The severed arm lies on the stone floor, the red vines slowly twitching in the pool of dark fluid. Beside them, Ulrich is lying motionless, the massive puddle of blood around him growing larger by the second. But then, the pool of blood on the floor begins to ripple. Roberta watches, her throat dry, as she notices not a single drop of blood is actually leaving Ulrich's wounds anymore. She takes a step back, her mind completely unable to find a logical explanation for what is happening. The fanged creature slowly stands up, the red vines in its shoulder writhing as if trying to reassemble its limb. But a shadow suddenly looms over it from behind. A hand reaches down, gripping the boy by his messy black hair with a crushing strength. With a single effortless motion, Ulrich slams the creature's head into the hard stone floor, crushing its skull. The body of the creature goes completely limp, sliding onto the tiles with a wet thud. Roberta is trembling so hard she can barely keep her grip on her weapon. Ulrich stands there, his throat completely torn open, yet he is looking at her with a perfectly calm, relaxed expression. He takes a slow breath, his voice completely clear. The blood on the floor begins to rise, defying gravity as it flows backward through the air. It streams back into his torn neck and his pierced chest, the fluid re-entering his veins. Roberta watches in sheer, unadulterated disbelief as the shredded muscle and skin knit themselves back together. Within seconds, his flesh is completely flawless, leaving behind no scars, no wounds, and no signs of trauma. He wipes a lingering smear of blood from his collar with a casual sigh. He looks at her and says this supernatural regeneration is the exact reason he has been able to walk the earth for over 1,400 years. Roberta stands frozen in the quiet study, her mind replaying the horror of the last 60 seconds. His throat was literally torn to shreds. His stomach was pierced by a veteran soldier's blade. By any medical or logical standard, Ulrich should be a corpse. Yet here he is, adjusting his collar, looking like he just finished a slightly inconvenient chore. She has studied every holy scripture and high-tier healing spell in the Grand Library, but none of them can draw blood backward and erase fatal wounds without leaving a single scar. She looks down at Rashid, who is kneeling in the middle of the room, staring at the motionless, vine-filled body of his son. The old soldier is completely broken, his hands trembling as he clutches his knees, all of his decades-long illusions shattered in a single night. He looks at the hollow, glassy eye of the creature on the floor. He asks Ulrich, his voice barely a raspy whisper, if his real son actually died a long time ago. Ulrich looks down at him, his expression soft but entirely honest. He tells him yes, the real boy died the exact moment he drowned in that stream 30 years ago. Rashid looks at the severed mass of red vines, asking what this monster actually is. Ulrich explains it is merely an alchemical parasite created by the researcher Rashid killed. The elixir wasn't a potion of youth, it was an active medium designed to house this plant-like parasite inside a dead biological host. He explains the mechanics. When Rashid poured the fluid down his dead son's throat, the body didn't wake up immediately because the parasite needed 3 days to physically take root, spread its vascular vines through the muscles, and seize complete control of the nervous system. Rashid asks why the creature followed him and called him father. Ulrich tells him the parasite didn't love him, it simply accessed the residual memories left in the boy's dead brain. The beast-like behavior, the attachment, the violent defense, it was all just a basic survival instinct to keep Rashid around as a convenient provider and physical shield. Rashid lowers his head, tears dripping onto the stone floor, acknowledging that his wife's final suspicious words were right all along. Ulrich kneels down to his level, his dark eyes observing the old man's grief. He asks Rashid if his wife was truly the only one who noticed. Over 30 years, surely other people must have pointed out that the boy was a monster that needed to be put down. And every single time someone spoke the truth, Rashid drew his sword and slaughtered them to protect his beautiful, comforting lie. He chose to defy the natural order of life and death because he was too weak to accept his son's passing. And to keep his eyes turned away from reality, he piled up a mountain of innocent bodies across the continent. Ulrich tells him that to undo a single tragic mistake, Rashid made far too many bloody sacrifices. Rashid doesn't deny it. He weeps, clutching the dead, vine-filled hand of the creature, admitting his immense foolishness and sin. He cries out that he just wanted his poor, innocent boy back, but instead, his son's resting place was violated by a parasitic monster. He looks up at Roberta, desperately asking if his real son's soul suffered because of his dark deeds, and if the boy's spirit was ever able to find peace in the afterlife. Roberta hesitates, looking at Ulrich, expecting him to offer a standard, comforting priest blessing to the dying man. But Ulrich doesn't believe in comfortable lies. He grabs Rashid by the shoulders, looks him straight in the eye, and delivers a line that stops Roberta's heart. There is no afterlife. There is only this harsh world, and the absolute end we call death. He tells him that because there is no heaven and no hell, his son's soul didn't suffer a single second of pain. He simply ceased to exist, resting in quiet peace. A few hours later, the heavy iron gates of the manor creak open. Rashid is quietly handed over to Dithmarshen's guards, his hands bound as he is led away to face a proper trial. The silver sword he used to kill so many lies abandoned on the cold floor, a silent monument to the lives he took to feed a delusion. Days pass, and the dark, blood-slicked drama of that night begins to fade. Down by the river, the local washerwomen casually gossip about how the Lord was apparently attacked in his office last week, but they laugh it off, continuing their chores under the pale winter sun without a single hint of worry or fear. Roberta watches them from the balcony, completely flabbergasted. The office was literally drenched in blood, yet the town treated the assassination attempt like a minor slip and fall. But as she looks out over the peaceful, snowy roofs of the castle, she begins to understand. She walks back into the study where Ulrich is already sitting at his desk, casually writing another document with his feather pen. He looks up, noticing her tense posture, and tells her she can ask whatever is on her mind. He notes that her thoughts must be in absolute disarray after witnessing his unnatural biology and hearing his claims about the afterlife. Roberta stays quiet for a long moment, then softly replies that she is completely fine. Of course she is curious. Her entire brain is screaming with 1,000 different questions, but his statement that there is no afterlife hangs heavily in the air between them. See, Roberta is a priestess of Ganymede. Her entire life, her training, her salary, her very identity is built upon the doctrine of souls ascending to heaven or descending to hell. To hear a 1,400-year-old human casually state that the afterlife is a myth is an absolute existential nightmare. As a servant of the church, she ought to stand up, point her finger, and challenge his heresy. But as she looks at his quiet, calm face, she knows his words didn't carry a single hint of deceit or manipulation. He was simply stating a mechanical fact of the universe. And that is exactly why she is too afraid to ask him to elaborate. She is terrified that if she pushes him for the details of his centuries-long journey, the truths he holds will completely shatter her entire worldview, leaving her with absolutely nothing to believe in. Ulrich watches her expression soften, then dips his pen back into the inkwell with a quiet nod. He lets out a soft chuckle, noting that her cautious hesitation makes her look exactly like Father Alonso in his youth. He recalls that Alonso was also incredibly curious, yet always knew exactly when to stop asking questions to preserve his own sanity. Roberta looks at him, realizing his relationship with her adoptive father is far deeper than Alonso ever let on. Ulrich reflects on his long life, stating that the people who managed to stay by his side the longest were all remarkably similar in that regard. Even Hildy, the previous ruler of Dithmarschen, only gathered the courage to ask him about his true nature on her deathbed. Roberta asks if Hildy was the previous lord, her interest piqued by the name. Ulrich doesn't answer directly, he just touches the golden signet ring on his finger, his gaze turning slightly melancholy. He tells Roberta that he has a strong feeling she is going to survive in this rugged territory for a very, very long time. Roberta looks at his youthful profile, realizing that beneath his smooth skin lies the crushing weight of countless centuries of lonely goodbyes. She quietly admits to herself that she is slowly growing accustomed to his unnatural presence. Weeks pass, and the harsh winter finally begins to draw toward its end, a single green sprout breaking through the melting snow under the bright blue sky. But as the seasons shift, something highly unusual begins to happen inside the manor. Ulrich retreats to his private quarters, closing his eyes, falling into a deep, endless slumber that no one in the castle can seem to wake him from. Our guy is finally waking up. His eyes slowly flutter open after a long, quiet sleep. The first thing he sees is a tiny nomadic kid holding a bunch of fresh spring flowers, staring at him like he's a ghost. The kid absolutely loses her mind with shock, dropping her bouquet as Ulrich sits up. She runs out of the tent screaming for her dad, leaving Ulrich alone to rub the sleep out of his eyes. He looks around the sunlit interior of the yurt, realizing he is currently resting with the nomadic Bard tribe. He picks up a single blue flower from the floor, realizing that winter has completely passed while he was unconscious. This is his life. He goes to sleep for a quick nap and wakes up in an entirely different season. The tent flap opens and a hand gently rests on the shoulder of the tribal leader, Kurt. Kurt steps inside, looking incredibly relieved to see his ageless lord finally sitting upright. He smiles warmly, welcoming Ulrich back to the land of the living. Ulrich stretches his neck, casually commenting on how the spring weather outside seems pretty nice. Kurt pours him a warm cup of tea, agreeing that spring is officially in full bloom. Ulrich asks exactly how long he was out of commission this time, and Kurt tells him it was just a little over a month. Kurt has a knowing look on his face as he sits down beside the bed. He reminds him that near the end of winter, Ulrich went out to hunt some local monsters and stopped by their tribe to rest. He walked into the yurt, lay down on the furs, and simply did not open his eyes again. Kurt laughs it off, saying a month is actually a pretty short nap for him. He recalls that when he was just a little altar boy at the manor, Ulrich went to sleep for an entire year. Behind them, Roberta is standing in the doorway, looking absolutely exhausted and incredibly stressed out. She sighs heavily, demanding to know how she is supposed to stay calm when her local lord spends a month looking like a literal corpse. Ulrich apologizes, explaining that listlessness occasionally washes over him. Whenever his ancient body runs low on energy, his biological systems simply shut down to preserve his cells. It is basically a natural hibernation cycle. Roberta stared at him, her eye twitching as she tries to process this absurd explanation. She groans, saying she has never seen anyone sleep like a bear in winter. Ulrich smiles, admitting he hears that quite often. He gets straight to the point, asking if anything major happened in the territory while he was playing Sleeping Beauty. Kurt tells him everything went smoothly. He says our giant companion, Bern, handled the local administrative affairs perfectly, which is no surprise since Ulrich raised the giant himself. But Ulrich ignores the compliment, turning his focus entirely onto Roberta. He asks how she has been holding up as the head priestess. Roberta looks away, admitting that restoring the messy parish hasn't been smooth sailing, but she is taking full responsibility for her duties. Ulrich tilts his head, realizing she didn't ride all the way out to the nomadic camps just to check on his sleep schedule. Roberta's expression goes serious. She reveals that some highly unusual guests have just arrived in Dithmarschen. They are a group of wealthy foreign knights, and they are desperately looking for a guide to take them deep into the forbidden ice peninsula to find a dragon. Now let's pause for a quick lore drop. A long time ago, the world was a burning hellscape covered in wildfire. The ancient gods brought water from another dimension to extinguish the flames and make the soil fertile. Once the land was cool, they began molding their physical creations. But they didn't start with humans. They reached down, touched a simple four-legged lizard, and bestowed upon it the very first spark of high intelligence. They named this creation Luavedra, the first sentient beings on Earth and the ancient ancestors of all modern dragons. As they ride their horses back toward the castle, Roberta is processing this history, realizing that the first intelligent beings weren't elves or dwarves, but reptiles. She looks at Ulrich, pointing out that this grand creation myth isn't written anywhere in the official church scriptures. Ulrich just dryly replies, "Of course not." He explains that human scriptures are entirely self-centered. They are stories written by humans, for humans, designed to help them survive and feel important. The dragons, on the other hand, are a dying race destined for total extinction. In a modern era dominated by human empires, nobody has the time or interest to care about a fading species. They are simply being erased from memory. Yet, these new guests have traveled across continents specifically looking for one. We cut to the grand meeting room of the manor. A red-haired noble with a mustache is speaking, explaining that they need an elite guide who knows the dangerous paths of the Ice Peninsula. He takes a sip of his tea, but as he looks across the table, a drop of nervous sweat rolls down his temple. He asks if this young-looking man sitting before him is truly the sovereign of Dithmarschen. He confesses that he heard rumors the Lord was an ancient man over 300 years old, and he was expecting a wrinkled grandfather. Roberta watches his confused face, remembering when she had the exact same look on her first day. To settle the dispute, Roberta steps forward, raising her hand to reveal her glowing blue holy crest of Ganymede. She officially guarantees that this young man is indeed Lord Ulrich, the undisputed ruler of Dithmarschen. The noble is stunned. He bows his head, introducing himself as Count Belito of Motrilda, hailing from the eastern kingdom of Carbonihar. He gestures to the silent, red-haired young man and the armored guards standing behind his chair, calling them his loyal vassals. He apologizes for his rudeness, admitting that it is physically impossible to guess Ulrich's real age by looking at his flawless face. Ulrich tells him it's fine, as he gets that reaction almost daily. Belito leans forward, returning to his main point. He reveals they have obtained highly reliable intelligence that the dragon they seek has made its nest on the Ice Peninsula. He drops the creature's ancient name, Narvakayani. It is a legendary frost dragon covered in pure white, translucent scales that shimmer like diamond. Ulrich rests his chin on his hand, casually confirming that their information is 100% accurate. Narvakayani is indeed nesting on the peninsula. Belito and his silent red-haired companion gasps, their eyes widening with sudden excitement. But before they can celebrate, Ulrich's voice drops an octave. He tells them that despite knowing where the dragon is, it is absolutely impossible to find a guide to take them there. Belito starts to argue, claiming they are fully aware the peninsula is a monster-infested wasteland, and they are willing to pay a king's ransom for the job. He says they can easily hire 50 more mercenary guards, but Ulrich cuts him off. He tells him that in the deep peninsula, adding more numbers just means a higher body count of people who will never return. Then Ulrich leans forward, his dark eyes locking onto the quiet, red-haired young man standing in the back of the room. He tells him that if he wants to go that badly, he should stop using a puppet to speak for him. He raises his finger, pointing directly at the silent youth, declaring that he is the actual master of this entire delegation. The red-haired young man freezes, his golden reptilian eyes widening in absolute shock as his cover is blown instantly. Hashtag Chapter 8. Ulrich's finger remains pointed, his expression completely relaxed as he tells the young man to step forward and speak for himself. He tells him that using a middle-aged noble as a decoy mouthpiece is a neat trick, but it doesn't work on someone who has lived for over a millennium. The red-haired youth stares at him, his golden eyes flashing with a predatory, slit-pupiled intensity in the dim light. The fake Count Bolito panics, waving his hands and screaming that Ulrich is spouting absolute nonsense. But Ulrich ignores him, telling the young man that the very moment he walked into the room, he could smell the ancient bloodline of Benares radiating off him. Bolito tries to keep up the act, but the young man reaches out, placing a firm, black-gloved hand on his shoulder and telling him to stand down. The youth sighs, stepping past the chair, admitting that the charade is officially over. He confirms he is indeed the real master of the group. He reveals his true, legendary identity. He is a celebrated hero of the Carbonar Kingdom, a direct descendant of the great King Benares, and the Duke of Thulamanca, Valenrio. He looks at Ulrich with deep suspicion, admitting that in his entire life no human has ever been able to see through his disguise and recognize his bloodline. This is a first. He demands to know how Ulrich could possibly identify a royal lineage from a kingdom thousands of miles away. Ulrich casually waves his hand, saying he simply sees a bit of the old King Benares in the boy's facial structure, though his memory of that era is slightly hazy. Valenrio's golden eyes narrow. He tells Ulrich that is physically impossible. He reminds him that the rumors claim the Lord of Dithmarschen is only 300 years old. But to have met King Benares in person, Ulrich would have to be born several centuries earlier. Ulrich takes a slow breath, looking out the window, and quietly drops another massive history lesson. He tells him that when he met Benares, he wasn't known as Ulrich of Dithmarschen. Valenrio and Bolito take a step back, the sheer absurdity of the claim making their skin crawl. Valenrio slams his hand on the table, demanding to know what name Ulrich used back when he supposedly shook hands with his royal ancestor. Roberta's eyes dart between them, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepares for another logic-defying reveal. Ulrich tilts his head back, muttering a list of his old alt-account names. Ganion, Ranier, Steinris. He thinks for a second, then recalls that he once combined the names Rosenberg and Braunstein to go by the alias Rosenstein. He taps his finger on his knee, remembering a specific era where he worked briefly under a wealthy nobleman in the eastern Villeneuve region. He looks at Valenrio and says, "Ah, yes, I think my name back then was Laurent." Valenrio's face drains of all color, his jaw dropping as he whispers the name Laurent in absolute disbelief. Ulrich nods, confirming it was Laurent de Villeneuve. He explains he tried adding a fancy noble title to his name back then, much like the ancient elves used to do. Valenrio completely loses his composure, his chair clattering against the floor as he stands up. He screams that Ulrich was the legendary Laurent, a figure he always assumed was just a myth his grandfather told him to make him sleep at night. He stares at Ulrich with a mixture of awe and terror, admitting his grandfather always spoke of an ageless companion named Laurent. The grandfather used to say that those who possess vast amounts of time are structurally destined to cross paths again in the future. Roberta's brain is doing frantic calculations in the corner. She looks at the gold coins on the table bearing the image of King Benares, realizing that if Benares lived 500 years ago, and this young duke is his actual grandson, then Ulrich's real age is so massive it practically breaks the calendar. She puts her hands on her head, completely overwhelmed by the scale of his existence. Ulrich ignores her mini panic attack, looking back at Valenrio. He tells him that his choice of alias is directly connected to the reason they traveled to this icy frontier. Valenrio looks down, his hands clenching into fists as the truth is laid bare. Ulrich asks him a direct, chilling question. Does the ancient blood of the white dragon, Narvakayani, flow through your veins? Before Valenrio can answer, the heavy doors of the study creak open. A young altar boy enters, carrying a massive, leather-bound volume that lands on the wooden table with a heavy thud. Ulrich thanks the boy, taking a pair of round-rimmed spectacles from his hands. Roberta's jaw drops again. She stares at him, internally screaming, "You wear glasses?" Ulrich puts the glasses on, explaining that this massive book is his personal journal, filled with detailed sketches of monsters he personally observed and recorded over the centuries. He flips the heavy parchment pages, promising to show them the actual reality of the creatures that inhabit the Ice Peninsula. Bolito and Valenrio lean forward, their eyes widening as they look at the hand-drawn illustrations. The book shows a terrifying predatory plant that emits hallucinogenic pollen, trapping explorers in its mouth, which mimics a fresh fruit, before digesting them with highly acidic sap. Below that is a horrific, multi-eyed purple spider that stabs its prey, injecting hundreds of eggs into the muscle tissue to devour the victim from the inside out. Roberta's face goes completely pale. She covers her mouth, realizing the peninsula is basically a living nightmare. Ulrich removes his glasses, explaining the history. Long ago, the brutal war between ancient elves and dwarves twisted the local flow of mana, mutating the flora and fauna into these biological monstrosities. Because of this, regular guides only operate in the relatively safe border zones. They will never, under any circumstances, go deep into the peninsula where the dragon resides. He looks at Valenrio, asking if he still intends to go forward without a guide, and what his plan is when he finally meets his father. Valenrio looks down, a bitter smile crossing his face. He confesses that many humans envy his heritage, because unlike other half-breeds, he has an elven-like lifespan. But he asks, what is the point of a long life when dragon half-breeds are completely sterile and cannot leave behind any descendants? We see a memory of a young Valenrio running through a graveyard, his mother having turned to dust centuries ago. To him, his royal clan feels like a group of complete strangers. He has lived for hundreds of years, but he has nothing he can leave behind, and absolutely nothing stays by his side. Ulrich tells him that a physical bloodline isn't the only legacy a man can leave behind in this world. Valenrio sighs, admitting that is easy for a powerful, ageless lord like Ulrich to say. But he is not strong. He is half human, yet he finds himself completely bound by the dragon blood in his veins. The only connection he has left to this world is his father, the ancient dragon. He looks up, his golden eyes filled with a deep, painful sincerity. He says he just wants to meet his father, talk to him once, and understand why he exists. That's all. Ulrich looks into his eyes, his ancient gaze searching the young duke's soul, asking if that is truly his only goal. Valenrio nods, his pride entirely gone. He looks at Ulrich, his voice trembling. He takes a slow step forward, his boots quiet on the stone floor. And then, the proud Duke of Thulamanca drops to both knees before Ulrich, begging him to show mercy and guide him, just as Laurent once guided his grandfather Benares. Ulrich stands over him in absolute silence, the weight of his long life reflecting in his dark eyes. He closes his eyes for a long moment, making his decision. He turns his head sharply, looking directly at Roberta, who is trying to blend into the wallpaper. He smiles gently and asks, "Roberta, have you gotten used to the freezing cold of Dithmarschen yet?" Roberta's face goes completely dark as she realizes she is about to be dragged into this suicidal expedition. She stammers that she finally got used to the winter, but Ulrich just chuckles, saying, "Then this won't be easy." He reaches out, telling Valenrio to stand up, agreeing to take him to the dragon's nest, but his expression turns incredibly serious as he delivers a final, non-negotiable warning. He tells the Duke that once they step onto the Ice Peninsula, they must follow his orders without a single question. We see a shot of the towering, ice-covered mountains of the peninsula through the window. Ulrich's voice is cold as the wind outside. He tells them that if they dare to ignore a single one of his commands, they will all end up dead. We close on Roberta struggling through a brutal whiteout blizzard, her face twisted in sheer terror as the freezing wind howls around her. The wind is absolutely howling, sweeping across the white peaks with a freezing, blinding intensity. We see our group struggling through a massive vertical ice ravine, looking like tiny black dots against the snow. Roberta is at the absolute end of her rope, her hood barely keeping the biting wind out of her face. She is staggering, her legs trembling as the cold slowly saps every bit of her physical energy. Her eyes are heavy, her vision blurring as the whiteout conditions make it impossible to tell up from down. She takes one slow, sluggish step forward, her consciousness beginning to slip away. Suddenly, a voice screams her name through the roaring storm. She loses her footing, her body tilting over the edge of a steep, snowy cliff. But before she can plunge into the abyss, a firm hand grabs her wrist with a crushing, secure grip. It is Ulrich. He pulls her back to safety, telling her to take a slow, steady breath. He asks if her mind felt incredibly hazy and dreamlike just a second ago. Roberta nods, still shivering in shock. Ulrich holds up his other hand, revealing a bizarre, writhing, brain-shaped, slimy creature crawling on his palm. He explains that these disgusting parasites ride the Arctic winds, aiming specifically for the heads of large animals to secrete a highly toxic hallucinogenic substance. Luckily, Roberta's heavy winter hood shielded her from the worst of the secretion, preventing a fatal fall. He turns to the rest of the party, warning them that a single moment of carelessness in these cliffside areas means an instant grave. Vilenrio and his men tighten their cloaks, realizing that our guy was not exaggerating when he called this place a domain of death. The blizzard shows zero signs of letting up as the sky begins to turn a dark, ominous blue. Ulrich guides them into the mouth of a hidden stone cave, announcing they will be spending the night there. Vilenrio walks inside, commenting that they should be out of the high mountain pass in 2 days. Roberta asks Ulrich how on earth he knew a secret cave was hidden behind the snowdrifts, and he casually replies that he passes through this area occasionally. He drops a heavy bundle of thick wooden logs onto the stone floor. Roberta looks at the wood in disbelief, asking how he managed to find dry firewood buried under 3 feet of solid ice. She touches the bark, noting that the logs are actually soaking wet and completely impossible to light with standard flint. But Ulrich just places his hands over the wet wood, his palms beginning to radiate a warm, golden mana. Within seconds, the moisture sizzles away, leaving the wood perfectly dry. Roberta asks if he is using raw magic just to prep a campfire. She comments on how incredibly delicate his mana control is, prompting Ulrich to admit he knows a basic trick or two. Roberta is highly impressed. Most high-tier mages can't dry wood without blowing it to splinters. Ulrich asks if Alonso didn't teach her basic mana manipulation, and Roberta lets out a stressed sigh. She admits that Father Alonso was a terrible teacher because his own mana pool was so massive that any attempt at fine-tuning usually resulted in a chaotic explosion. Ulrich chuckles, telling her to grab a piece of wet wood and give it a try herself under his guidance. Roberta flushes with embarrassment, but Ulrich gently takes her hand, telling her to trust his instructions. He explains that manipulating mana is entirely about physical feel, not rigid academic formulas. He tells her to open her internal gateway slowly, letting her energy seep into the wet wood to push the moisture out, promising to absorb any excess energy if she slips up. Roberta closes her eyes, focusing her mind as a soft, warm light begins to glow between her hands. The steam slowly rises from the bark as her mana successfully dries the wood. She opens her eyes, absolutely thrilled, shouting that she actually did it. Ulrich smiles, telling her to remember that exact sensation and practice it often. Vilenrio watches them from the corner of the fire, commenting that Ulrich is an incredibly talented teacher. He says his grandfather, King Benares, used to praise Ulrich's guidance constantly, and now he finally understands why. Ulrich waves off the praise, calling instruction a simple hobby. He says there is nothing more rewarding than watching a talented pupil grow. He looks into the fire, noting that King Benares was exactly the same way, absolutely overflowing with natural talent. Vilenrio smiles, but Ulrich shakes his head, stating that he merely pointed the young king in the right direction. Actually taking the steps and moving forward was entirely up to Benares himself. He stands up, his shadow stretching across the damp cave walls. Later that night, the fire is crackling merrily, warming the cold stone interior. Roberta pours a fresh cup of hot liquid, handing it over to Count Bolito. She offers him some of Dithmarshen's famous Manhwa tea to warm his bones. Bolito sniffs the cup, his nose wrinkling at the bitter, chemical aroma, while Roberta smiles mischievously. She sits down, her expression turning slightly thoughtful as she looks toward the entrance of the cave. Ulrich stands up, wrapping his cloak around his shoulders, announcing he is going to take a quick look outside. He says dry jerky and hard biscuits aren't enough to sustain the guards, so he is going to hunt for some fresh meat nearby. Vilenrio instantly rises, offering to accompany him into the dark. Roberta stands up too, wanting to join. But Ulrich tells her to stay in the cave, watch over the shivering guards, and collect some clean snow. He tells her that brewing a fresh batch of Manhwa tea is her primary mission for the night. He walks out into the howling storm, with the red-haired Duke following close behind. Back by the fire, Roberta turns to Count Bolito, her curiosity finally getting the better of her. She asks him what kind of legendary figure King Benares actually was. Bolito smiles, taking a sip of his tea, glad to share the grand history of his homeland. He says there is a very famous story passed down through generations in the kingdom of Carbonihar. Before the great King Benares could ever ascend the throne, he was forced to survive 4 massive fatal crises. The first crisis struck when Benares was a young prince of only 10 years old. His father, the reigning king, was brutally murdered in his bed by a faction of violent rebels. The rebels hunted the young prince to end the royal line, but a mysterious knight staying at the palace suddenly appeared, drew his sword, and saved his life. The prince was trapped in the dark palace, surrounded by assassins with blood on their blades. The rebels reached out to end the young prince's life, determined to erase any chance of future revenge. But the guest knight stepped between them, his silver blade reflecting the moonlight. His name was Laurent de Villeneuve. Bolito explains that thanks to Laurent single-handedly fighting off 6 elite rebel generals for 48 straight days, the young prince was able to escape to a neighboring country. However, 8 years later, the rebels invaded the neighboring kingdom, defeated Benares' remaining forces, and captured him. He was locked inside an iron carriage, dragged back to Carbonahar to face public execution. But as the transport carriage stopped briefly in a rural transit city, a mysterious hunter appeared in the middle of the night. The hunter wore a dark cap with a white feather, his face hidden in deep shadow. He unlocked the iron cage, pulled the prince out, and guided him through a dense forest inhabited by a mad flesh-eating witch to shake off the pursuit. Bolito stares into his teacup, noting that the 3rd and 4th saviors were remarkably similar. When the prince was framed for a coup and sentenced to hang, an anonymous dark-robed priest suddenly arrived with perfect evidence of his innocence. And when Benares was poisoned by a rival lord and fell into suspended animation, a mysterious alchemist arrived from a neighboring country with the perfect antidote. Having survived these 4 near-fatal encounters, Benares eventually overthrew the usurper, ascended the throne, and became a legendary king. He ruled his kingdom with absolute wisdom until the ripe old age of 90. But Bolito notes that all 4 saviors vanished without accepting a single gold coin as a reward. Once the king was secure on his throne, he distributed royal proclamations across the continent to find his saviors. But the public posters didn't contain descriptions of their faces or names. Instead, they were simply beautifully written messages of gratitude and blessings meant for them to read wherever they were. Roberta's eyes widen in the firelight as she processes the timeline of these 4 historical events. She looks at the cave entrance, a massive, mind-blowing realization hitting her. What if those 4 legendary saviors were actually all the same person? Bolito nods, confirming that Duke Valenrio is absolutely certain the knight, the hunter, the priest, and the alchemist were all Laurent, our guy, the Lord of Dithmarschen. Roberta asks if Bolito truly trusts the Duke's wild theory. Bolito's expression turns fiercely proud. He says he trusts his master implicitly, not just because of the historical evidence, but because his own family has been indebted to the Duke's line for generations. Whether it is a matter of ancient lore or a dangerous hunt for dragons, they intend to follow the Duke to the absolute end of the earth. Suddenly, the snow at the cave entrance rustles, and Ulrich and Valenrio walk back inside, carrying a massive, blood-dripping sack. Roberta recoils, her nose wrinkling as she asks what on earth is inside the bag. They both look at her with matching, highly suspicious smiles and simply reply, "Meat." She asks what kind of monster they killed, but they refuse to answer. 2 days later, the storm finally clears, revealing a beautiful sunlit sky. The group finally descends the steep mountain trails, stepping onto the flat, snowy plains of the lower peninsula. The hiking is significantly easier now, but letting their guard down in a monster realm is an absolute rookie mistake. One of Bolito's guards wanders away from the main path to inspect some ruins. The snow explodes with a massive impact. A colossal, sand-colored, carnivorous worm monster with rows of circular razor-sharp fangs bursts from the earth, clamping its jaws around the guard. Valenrio lets out a furious scream, lunging forward to grab the guard's arm, but the monster's bite is too clean, crushing the man instantly. The worm thrashes, its rocky hide smashing into the ground as Valenrio is thrown backward, but Ulrich is already in midair. He swings his sword in a flawless horizontal arc, slicing the massive beast in half. He lands smoothly, yelling at Roberta to take the injured and get back up the path. But the severed upper half of the worm monster thrashes in its death throes, its massive weight crashing directly into Ulrich and dragging him over the edge of the snowy ravine. Ulrich disappears over the cliffside, swallowed by the falling snow and the massive body of the beast. The impact shakes the entire ravine as the monster's carcass crashes to the bottom of the deep crater. Valenrio scrambles to the edge, his red hair whipping in the wind as he prepares to jump down to save him. But Roberta lunges forward, grabbing him by his fur cloak with all her strength, screaming that he cannot go down there. Valenrio is furious, demanding to know what she is doing. But Roberta looks him straight in the eye and shouts, "The Lord won't die!" Valenrio freezes, completely confused by her absolute certainty. They look down into the crater where a massive dark pool of blood is slowly spreading across the white snow. It looks like a fatal, crushing impact. Any regular human would be reduced to paste. Roberta's face is covered in sweat as she internally prays that Ulrich's passive regeneration works exactly like it did back in his study. Down in the dark crater, the spilled blood begins to ripple, defying gravity as it flows backward, gathering in the center of the snow. The guards watch from the cliff, completely dumbfounded as the blood literally re-enters his torn flesh. A pale, dirt-covered hand suddenly bursts through the packed snow. Ulrich crawls out of the crater, coughing up a mouthful of snow, his clothes shredded but his physical body completely flawless and uninjured. He climbs back up the path, carrying the body of the deceased guard. He looks at Valenrio, his expression heavy with a quiet apology for being too late to save the man. Valenrio can only stare at him, his mind completely blown by the sheer impossible scale of Ulrich's biology. Roberta immediately kneels beside Count Bolito, who injured his leg during the chaos, and channels her healing magic into the wound. Valenrio tells Ulrich that Bolito wouldn't have survived the initial attack if not for his swift intervention, so they should be thanking him instead of accepting apologies. Ulrich pulls on a spare shirt, calmly stating that the fall hurt quite a bit, but it won't be a permanent problem. He looks at the injured Count, his tone turning sharp and serious. He tells them that they are the ones causing unnecessary trouble. Just because the terrain got flatter doesn't mean they are safe. In fact, the fertile plains of the lower peninsula house significantly more mutated monsters than the freezing mountain passes. This is where the true boundary of the demon realm begins. He warns them that if they don't stay sharp, another disaster will strike, and he cannot save everyone. Count Bolito grinds his teeth, nodding in silent agreement as Roberta finishes wrapping his leg in bandages. With the sudden loss of one of their guards, the comfortable atmosphere of the group instantly evaporates. Roberta looks at the dark woods ahead, her eyes filled with a quiet dread. She realizes that despite Ulrich's warning, this is only the absolute beginning of the terrors waiting for them. At Duke Valenrio's request, Roberta leads a quiet prayer for the guard who was just crushed by that giant worm monster. The atmosphere is incredibly heavy, but they have to keep it brief because once night falls in this frozen hell, monsters will swarm them like a lobby full of tryhards. Roberta finishes up, still visibly shaken by how fast a life can just end out here. Ulrich steps up to the wooden cross, gently brushing the fresh snow off the rough wood. He knows better than anyone that no matter how many times you have to say goodbye, the only real choice is to keep walking. Another day passes, and another person dies. While Ulrich is away handling some unnamed business, the reality of this expedition really starts to sink in. 3 days later, the sky literally splits as a massive horned green bird monster ambushes them from the clouds, and by the next day, another guard loses a leg. After 14 straight days of this absolute nightmare, the party is running on pure survival instinct. Valenrio looks up, his golden eyes scanning the horizon, and asks if they have finally reached the coordinates. Ulrich looks ahead and confirms that yes, the frost dragon Narvakayani has made his lair somewhere in those towering jagged peaks. Roberta looks at the massive vertical walls of ice and panics, asking if they seriously have to scale that monstrous thing. Ulrich just smiles and tells her not to worry. They keep moving, walking across a vast, flat sheet of ancient blue ice that looks like it has been frozen solid since the dawn of time. As they push through a dense thicket of snow-laden pines, a massive structure suddenly looms through the freezing mist. Roberta freezes, her breath hitching in her throat as she stares ahead. High-angle shot of the tiny party standing at the base of a giant, crumbling stone cylinder. It is an ancient, ruined tower, completely out of place in this barren wasteland of monsters. They step inside, their boots crunching softly on the thick layers of frost covering the stone floor. The wind howls through the hollow top of the tower, swirling the snow around them like a frozen hurricane. Roberta is completely baffled, wondering out loud why anyone in their right mind would build a structure like this on the ice peninsula. Valenrio doesn't answer. He is staring intently at the wall, running his hand over the ancient stone. There are faint, jagged markings etched deep into the masonry. The engravings are crude but deliberate, surviving centuries of brutal Arctic weather. Roberta walks over and asks if those markings are actually some form of writing. Valenrio confirms they are. She asks him if he can decipher it, but he just shakes his head, completely stumped by the ancient characters. Ulrich steps forward, his dark eyes scanning the carvings. He calmly explains that it is some sort of last will. Roberta looks up at him, shocked that he can casually read a dead language like it is a modern text message. Ulrich's expression goes completely flat. He stares at the cold stone, his gaze carrying the weight of 1,000 years. "We are now dying." That is exactly what the inscription says. Roberta asks if this is the language of the elves or the dwarves who fought that legendary apocalyptic war here. Ulrich tells her no. He places his hand against the frozen wall, the heavy gold ring on his finger catching the dim light. He explains that as the era of the dwarves was coming to an end and the era of elves was beginning to rise, a group of humans tried to found their own nation here. But they failed to survive. This tower is nothing more than a headstone for a forgotten human colony that got absolutely wiped out by the harsh reality of this land. Here is how this peninsula actually works. Originally, the Ice Peninsula was divided into a separate island and the mainland. But towards the end of the war, the elves did something completely insane. They literally dragged the entire island across the ocean and merged it with the mainland to crush the dwarf stronghold, completely distorting the flow of mana in the process. Let that sink in. The elves were playing Tectonic Plate SimCity just to win a siege, and the fragile humans who lived here were just caught in the crossfire and died. But today, those same fragile humans are the ones leading the world and running the entire era. It makes you wonder how such a weak race managed to rise from the dirt to become the dominant species on the planet. Ulrich asks the group, how do you think that became possible while Valenrio and his remaining guards silently eat their hot soup? Roberta, being the loyal priestess she is, recites the official church answer, stating that it is all thanks to the grace of Lord Hestio. The scriptures claim that during the era of gods, all things were born under heavenly power and lived in absolute peaceful harmony. But that peace soon came to a crashing end when the gods decided to pack up and leave the heavens, leaving only endless chaos and violence behind. Before leaving, the gods urged Hestio to depart with them, wanting him to join their divine retreat. But Hestio chose to reject the heavens, deciding to stay on earth with his human kin to guide them through the dark. Raised in his warm embrace, humans set off on various paths, harboring their own grand ideals. But they couldn't overcome the brutal currents of the era and all met an unjust, violent end, just like the poor souls who built this tower. Overcome with sorrow for his dying children, Hestio gathered all the remaining humans into a single massive group. He appointed one master to lead them, giving them the absolute authority to build a unified civilization, and that was the birth of the First Empire and the First Emperor. By uniting under one absolute throne, humans gained a power greater than any other race, and that is how they succeeded in carving their name into history. Ulrich listens patiently, then casually asks Roberta if she remembers their conversation about Ruobedra, the first dragon. Valenrio's head snaps up, his golden eyes narrowing at the mention of the legendary dragon progenitor. Ulrich explains that if you look at the real history, Ruobedra walked almost the exact same path as Hestio. He was offered a place with the gods, but chose to stay behind to save his kin. Roberta's jaw drops. She points out that this story would completely turn the Holy Church upside down if they heard it, because the scriptures explicitly state Hestio was the only savior. Ulrich just dryly tells her that this is the raw truth, but despite trying to walk the exact same path, dragons and humans met completely different ends. One rose to rule, while the other fell into a slow decline. Valenrio looks at him, completely silent, waiting for the explanation. Ulrich looks back at him, his voice dropping to a serious, heavy tone. He explains that unlike humans, dragons do not usually group up. They are solitary, fiercely independent creatures. Their individual pride is so massive that they refuse to form flocks, and they do not easily submit to anyone, not even to their own biological progenitor. In the end, their own unmatched arrogance is what brought about the slow, painful decline of their entire race. That is what dragons are like, Valenrio. Ulrich looks him dead in the eye and warns him that even if he meets Narvakayani, the ancient dragon will never be able to fill the deep, hollow emptiness inside his soul. But even knowing that, the reason I brought you all the way here is, Before he can finish his sentence, a massive, booming shockwave shakes the entire stone tower. Roberta panics, clutching her bowl as the stone walls start to crack. What is that sound? They look out into the pitch-black Arctic night, the blizzard howling outside. A colossal silhouette slowly emerges from the freezing mist, dwarfing the pine trees around it. It is a giant. A wild, massive giant, and his eyes are glowing with a hostile amber light. The giant lifts a colossal wooden spear, swinging it down with enough physical force to split the mountain. The air screams as the weapon tears through the dark. "My liege!" the guard screams as the massive wooden spear crashes directly through the stone wall of the tower. Ulrich doesn't hesitation. He grabs Roberta and yells, "Dodge!" as the stone explodes around them. The debris flies everywhere as the giant's attack completely shatters the entrance of the tower. Standing in the middle of the wreckage is the massive wild giant, looking down at them like they are insects. He swings the colossal weapon again, the sheer wind pressure throwing snow and rock into the air. Roberta lets out a terrified scream as the ceiling begins to collapse over their heads. Valenrio's guard lunges forward, trying to draw his weapon to defend his master. Ulrich moves like absolute lightning, tackling Roberta to the frozen ground as the massive spear tip grazes the space they were standing in a millisecond ago. The spear tears through the stone, sending sparks flying in the dark. Valenrio jumps backward, his dragon reflexes allowing him to execute a perfect mid-air dodge as the floor beneath him caves in. He lands cleanly, his eyes blazing as he checks on the party. "Are you okay? Everyone on our side is safe!" Ulrich calmly gets to his feet, shielding Roberta behind his back. "Stand back, Roberta!" He steps out of the crumbling ruins, his posture completely relaxed despite facing a 30-foot-tall engine of destruction. Don't worry, giants generally have poor wits, but they still belong to the category of intelligent beings. He reaches into his cloak and pulls out a strange, glowing red scaly cord that looks like a whip. The giant lets out a guttural, earth-shaking roar, charging forward to finish them off. Ulrich just sighs. Although, of course, there are always ignorant ones like this who need a physical lesson. He snaps his wrist, sending the red cord whipping through the freezing air with surgical precision. The whip wraps flawlessly around the giant's running ankle, binding his leg tight. Ulrich plants his feet and pulls with absolute, inhuman physical leverage. The giant's eyes widen in sheer panic as he suddenly loses all forward momentum. The massive creature crashes face first into the deep snow with a thunderous impact that shakes the entire valley. Roberta and Valenrio can only stare in absolute sweat-drop disbelief. Our guy really just tripped a 30-foot giant with a piece of glowing rope. Ulrich casually walks up to the groaning, dazed giant, the red whip still coiled in his hand. He lightly taps the side of the giant's massive face. "Do you remember me?" Ulrich asks, his voice calm and completely unbothered. The giant looks up, his amber eyes blinking as he recognizes the ageless face before him. "Human king, I am hit." Ulrich smiles faintly. "Go and tell Uar that I am waiting here." We skip to the next morning. A beautiful golden sunrise washes over the majestic, snow-capped peaks of the peninsula. Roberta is sitting against a stone block, her head nodding as she struggles to stay awake, completely exhausted from the night's chaos. A hand gently taps her on the shoulder. She startles awake in a comedic panic, her face flushing red. "Huff!" she stammers, looking around wildly. "But we don't know when another wild giant might decide to come back and finish the job." Ulrich points to the rest of the party, who are still fast asleep around a small campfire. "We are nearing the destination of our journey. To endure until the end, you need to save your strength." Roberta looks down, but before she can argue, a heavy, rhythmic booming sound begins to echo through the valley. 3 massive, towering silhouettes emerge from the morning mist, walking slowly towards their camp. Roberta panics again, but Ulrich just looks up calmly. "They will guide us the rest of the way." The leader of the group steps forward. It is a massive bald giant with pale blue skin, giant white eyebrows, and a long white beard. He steps into the clearing, the ground shaking under his massive weight. He reaches down with a hand the size of a carriage, lunging straight for Ulrich. Roberta is frozen in pure terror, thinking her lord is about to be crushed into paste. My liege! Ulrich!" she screams. But instead of crushing him, the massive giant scoops Ulrich up into a giant happy bear hug. The giant laughs boisterously, his voice booming like thunder. "So much time has passed! Has it been about 10 years? Ulrich dryly corrects him. "It's been a little over 12 years. The giant's loud voice continues to boom through the canyon while Roberta and Valenrio just stand there with blank, sweat-dropped expressions. Behind the old giant are two intimidating escorts wearing creepy skull masks, one bird, one ram. The old giant notes that he heard a lot has happened in the human world since they last spoke. I have my own ways of hearing things, the giant says, his golden eyes shining with intelligence. He looks down, his massive gaze suddenly locking onto Roberta. Did you get yourself a new woman in the meantime? Roberta's face turns bright red and she screams, "Excuse me?" Ulrich calmly clarifies, "She is my priestess. Alonso raised her." The giant's eyebrows shoot up. "Alonso? That sneaky bastard actually raised a child?" He shakes his head, remarking on how incredibly short human lifespans are. Roberta is just standing there thinking, wait, sneaky? The giant gets down to business, asking if they are looking for him because of the white dragon, Narvakayani. Ulrich confirms they are. The giant warns them that he doesn't want a repeat of the violent disaster that happened last time. Ulrich points to Valenrio and says, "Bailen." Valenrio steps forward, bowing his head respectfully. Ulrich explains, "This child is a descendant of Narvakayani." The giant's eyes widen in absolute genuine shock. He reaches down and literally grabs Valenrio by his entire head like a claw machine. "Nice to meet you. I am... a descendant?" the giant exclaims, turning Valenrio's head around like a shiny toy. Looking at him, the mate must have been human. He squishes Valenrio's face between his massive fingers, a dragon hybrid with a human that is very, very rare. He looks at Ulrich. Isn't it the first time a hybrid has appeared since the first dragon Ruobedra died? Ulrich tells him no, there were a few more in between. Ulrich pulls out a heavy leather pouch. "I will pay the price of passage with this. I received it from the forest elves." The giant happily accepts the treasure, pointing down the pass. "Of course. Can you guide us to the entrance?" "Of course." The old giant gestures to his skull-masked escorts, clicking his fingers. Then, the skull-masked giants loom over Roberta and Valenrio. Without warning, they scoop them up, tossing them onto their massive shoulders. "We will escort you with care." Roberta is screaming internally, while Valenrio looks thoroughly humbled. Suddenly, the snowy mountains fade away, replaced by a warm breeze carrying a single green leaf. We transition to a bright, stunning grassy meadow filled with blue and white flowers under a perfect, cloudless blue sky. A breathtakingly beautiful, white-haired, elf-like figure is resting in a chair. He slowly opens his dark eye, which reflects a brilliant blue light. "Somebody," he whispers, turning his head. Back in the real world, Roberta is riding on the giant's shoulder, her eyes wide as they approach a massive hidden valley. He is coming this way. The giants march forward through the final snowy pass. In the beautiful meadow, the white-haired entity rises from his chair, his long, delicate hands ending in sharp, claw-like nails. I should prepare to welcome the guests. It is Narvakayani, the legendary frost dragon, and he is waiting. If we were traveling on our own feet, we would have spent days taking detours through the freezing valleys, but when you are hitching a ride on the shoulders of ancient giants, the terrain is basically just flat ground. The old giant Rugen finally stops, pointing his massive blue finger toward a solid wall of snow. The hidden entrance to the frost dragon's domain is apparently right in front of them, though to anyone else it just looks like a dead end. Ulrich hops down from the giant's hand, his boots landing softly in the deep powder. He asks Rugen how long the giant can wait, and Rugen offers him a single day before they have to head back. The old giant then turns his massive gaze toward Valenrio, calling him by his nickname, Balin. He slaps the Duke on the back with enough physical force to register as a minor seismic event. Rugen laughs, offering a prayer to Lord Dias for their success, which is pretty hilarious considering giants don't even worship human gods. With that, the giants turn around and march back into the freezing mist, their heavy footsteps shaking the valley. Roberta shivers, looking up at the towering ice wall, and asks if they need to start climbing now. Ulrich tells her no. There is no need to climb because the owner of this mountain already knows they are standing on his doormat. Suddenly, a telepathic voice rings out directly inside their skulls, echoing with a quiet, chilling authority. Roberta and the knights jump, but Ulrich doesn't even blink, calmly gesturing for them to follow him. He walks right up to the solid wall of blue ice and reaches his hands straight into it. Instead of hitting rock, his arm slips into the frost as if the mountain were made of liquid water. Roberta's eyes go completely wide, her high-strung brain trying to process the magic. She takes a deep, freezing breath, trying to steady her racing heart. She closes her eyes, steels her nerves, and plunges her hand directly into the rippling portal. As she steps through, the biting cold instantly vanishes, replaced by a warm, fragrant breeze and falling petals. She opens her eyes to see a breathtaking, sunlit green meadow stretching out under a perfect blue sky. She is completely disoriented, wondering if this entire landscape is just a massive illusion. Ulrich explains that it is not a dream. The space they are standing in is completely physical and real. Dragons are basically living cheat codes who can manipulate raw mana to rewrite environmental laws, creating their own custom pocket dimensions. To be precise, the freezing mountain wall they saw on the outside was the actual illusion. And the dragon built this warm paradise simply because he absolutely hates the cold, which is a pretty funny trait for a frost dragon. Ulrich calls out the dragon's name, Kayani, as a silver-haired figure comes into view. Kayani is sitting elegantly at a white tea table, dryly apologizing for only preparing one extra teacup. He looks up with a beautiful, piercing gaze, asking Ulrich what brings him to his nest after all these decades. Roberta is completely paralyzed, staring at the dragon's human form. He looks like a high-tier gacha game character, possessing an ethereal, delicate beauty that doesn't look human at all. Ulrich gets straight to the point, telling Kayani that someone has traveled across the continent just to meet him. Kayani tilts his head, his dark reptilian eyes scanning the travelers. His gaze lands on Vilenrio, who is standing stiffly between his loyal knights. Kayani rises from his chair, his movements fluid and silent as he glides across the grass. His pale feet brush against the green blades, his expression shifting to one of mild curiosity. He stands right in front of Vilenrio, looking up at the tall, red-haired duke. He gently reaches up, cupping Vilenrio's jaw with his long, claw-like fingers. He looks deep into Vilenrio's golden, slitted eyes and asks whose child he is. Ulrich steps in, dropping the bomb without a shred of hesitation. Kayani, this is your biological son. Kayani pauses, repeating the word with a look of genuine surprise. Vilenrio's voice trembles as he reveals his mother's name was Penelope, asking if his father remembers her. Kayani's eyes widen slightly. He admits that as a dragon, his memory is perfect, so there is no way he would forget Penelope. Here is how that relationship actually happened. Decades ago, Penelope was a princess of the Carbonahar kingdom, back when the nation's internal security was incredibly weak. She was cornered in a dark alley by a group of heavily armed palace assassins. Kayani happened to be passing through and casually slaughtered the attackers, saving her life. Penelope was an incredibly strong-willed, fierce human woman, which Kayani found highly unusual. Her unique personality was so refreshing that the dragon decided to stay by her side for a short while. Vilenrio looks hopeful, expecting some sort of warm parental validation, but Kayani just lets go of his face, his expression turning cold and indifferent. He looks at Ulrich, completely ignoring Vilenrio, and asks why they bothered to bring this child here. He calls the entire reunion a complete waste of time, instantly crushing the Duke's expectations. Kayani calmly explains that he has absolutely no interest in forming emotional attachments. His time spent with Penelope was nothing more than a scientific experiment to study human behavior. He looks Vilenrio in the eye and flatly confirms that yes, every single emotion and interaction with his mother was just an act. Vilenrio's fist clenches so hard, his dark leather glove creaks under the strain. His face contorts with rage as he asks if his entire life and birth were completely meaningless to his father. Kayani looks at him with a blank, pitiless expression, remarking on how humans are always desperately searching for meaning. He points out that humans are a bizarrely exhausting race who write elaborate scriptures, accumulate empty knowledge, build fragile families, and obsess over raising children just to feel important. He lets out a soft sigh, clearly bored by the emotional weight Vilenrio is trying to force onto him. But then, Kayani's eyes narrow, a dark, mocking smile playing on his lips. He asks Vilenrio if he is simply tired of living as a fragile, short-lived human. Roberta gasps, realizing the dragon has just seen through the Duke's deepest, hidden motive. Kayani chuckles, his voice dripping with amusement as he leans close. He accuses Vilenrio of traveling all this way for one specific thing. He wants his father to help him undergo molting. Roberta is confused, but Ulrich quickly explains the biological reality of dragon hybrids to her. When a dragon has offspring with a human, the children are naturally born with human bodies, but they possess a single, dormant evolutionary pathway. This process is akin to shedding an old, fragile skin, which is why the ancient texts call it molting. Valenrio stands frozen, sweat dripping down his neck as his secret plan is laid bare before everyone. Suddenly, Kayani's body begins to expand, white gleaming scales erupting across his skin as he transforms into a colossal dragon. He looms over his son, offering to let Valenrio shed his human shell to become a strong, beautiful dragon just like him. Chapter 14. Valenrio stares up at the massive white dragon, his mind spiraling back into his own lifelong identity crisis. He has always stood on the boundary, living too long to relate to normal humans, but possessing no scales or claws to be accepted as a dragon. He spent his youth watching everyone he loved wither away and die, realizing that his long lifespan was nothing but a slow, isolating curse. So when he first learned about the existence of molting, it felt like a magical escape hatch. He believed that if he could just cast aside his human half, he would finally find a place where he belonged. But looking at the cold, empty eyes of his biological father, he starts to hesitate. He asks Kayani if there is a chance the transformation process can fail. The massive dragon looks down, confirming that if he is unlucky, the molting will fail, and he will be permanently locked in his human form forever. Roberta turns to Ulrich, asking in a panicked whisper if he knew the Duke was planning this suicidal gamble from the very start. Ulrich quietly tells her that he expected as much, knowing the deep desperation that drives hybrid bloodlines. Valenrio steps back, admitting that while his desire to see his father was genuine, he definitely had dual motives for this trip. He looks out over the beautiful, artificial meadow, his posture slumping with defeat. He thought that turning into a dragon would solve all his existential problems, but the reality is incredibly disappointing. Kayani lets out a massive yawn, completely indifferent to his son's dramatic emotional crisis. Ulrich asks Valenrio if he is disappointed by how cold his father turned out to be. Valenrio lets out a bitter laugh, gesturing to his exhausted, injured knights who sacrificed everything just to get him here. But then, his expression darkens. He rationalizes that if he succeeds in molting, he won't have to care about these pathetic human emotions anymore. Ulrich steps forward, his voice dropping to a heavy, serious tone as he tells Valenrio that is completely impossible. He places a firm hand on the Duke's shoulder, looking him dead in the eye. He explains that even if the transformation succeeds and Valenrio becomes a dragon, he will still be fundamentally different from Kayani. Because unlike a pure dragon, Valenrio will still carry the indelible memories of his time spent as a human. He will still remember the warmth of a mother's embrace, the laughter shared around a campfire, and the pain of losing a friend. Unless those memories are completely erased, he can never truly become a heartless, solitary monster, which is why Ulrich has a different proposal for him. Ulrich looks back, remembering a time centuries ago when he went by the name Oscar. During that era, he wandered the world alongside Kayani, a journey that neither of them originally wanted. But that shared experience is the exact reason Kayani first developed an interest in humanity, leading to his eventual encounter with Penelope. In a very literal sense, Ulrich's past actions are the reason Valenrio even exists in this world today. Valenrio stares at him, completely stunned by the realization of how deep their history goes. Ulrich proposes a deal. Instead of throwing away his humanity, why doesn't Valenrio travel the world with his father? Kayani shifts back into his human form, looking highly skeptical about leaving his cozy nest again, but Ulrich points out that both of them possess incredibly long, virtually endless lifespans. Instead of sitting alone in a cave letting boredom slowly eat away at their minds, they might as well take on a challenge. Valenrio wants to know how he is supposed to teach a dragon about humanity when even Ulrich failed to do so. Ulrich smiles gently, explaining that because Valenrio stands precisely on the boundary between both worlds, he is the perfect bridge to connect them. He tells him that just like history, even the hearts of dragons are bound to change eventually. He raises his left hand, the golden ring on his finger catching the sunlight. He asks the descendant of Benares if he is willing to take on this endless journey. Valenrio's eyes fill with tears of relief, and he calls Ulrich by his ancient name Laurent, promising to do as he asks. Ulrich smiles, telling them both to reach out to him if they ever get lost along the way. With the hybrid's heritage fully awakened, the father and son decide to set off on a journey across the continent together. Kayani takes a seat back at his table, picking up his teacup with a smooth, elegant motion. He admits that he is highly curious to see how such fragile, short-lived creatures manage to dominate the modern era. He notes that this time, he won't even have to mimic Ulrich's old tricks to get along with humans. Roberta, however, is staring at Kayani's cup in absolute sweat-dropped horror, realizing he is casually drinking the bitter, toxic Manhwa tea. Kayani smiles, looking forward to the journey as the warm wind rustles the green grass. A few days later, our party finally bids farewell to the Duke and his loyal vassals at the edge of the snowy plains. Roberta watches their figures shrink into the distance, a quiet melancholy settling over her. She realizes that due to the massive gulf in their lifespans, she will likely never live long enough to see how their story ends. Her own human time is far too short to wait for a dragon's journey to reach its conclusion. She offers a quiet prayer to Mother Ganymede, asking the goddess to watch over them in the vast world. We cut to a few days later, back inside the familiar, warm stone study of the Dithmarschen manor. Ulrich is sitting at his desk, wearing his reading glasses, as Roberta quietly enters the room. He looks up, asking her what brings her to his office at such a late hour. Roberta hesitates, her fingers clutching her robes as she struggles to find the right words. She confesses that during their long, dangerous journey to the Ice Peninsula, she was struck by a very specific, unsettling feeling. She looks him dead in the eye, her voice trembling as she asks, "My lord, you are planning to abandon Dithmarschen and leave us, aren't you?" Several months have passed since our survival trip to the Ice Peninsula came to an end, and Dithmarschen has officially made the transition from spring to summer. Even though the daytime sun is finally melting the thick sheets of ice, the northern nights are still incredibly brutal. Roberta wanders through the dark, drafty corridors of the cathedral, holding her lantern close to combat the freezing air. She looks completely exhausted, her high-strung brain running in circles as she tries to find the courage to ask the one question she has been holding in. She approaches the heavy wooden door of Ulrich's private office, hearing the soft scratch of a quill on parchment inside. She gently pushes the door open, calling out to her lord with a quiet, hesitant voice. Ulrich looks up from his desk, noting that it is incredibly rare for his high-strung priestess to pay him a visit at this hour. He welcomes her inside, casually mentioning that sleep is a concept he does not really participate in much these days anyway. Roberta steps into the study and instantly starts shivering, realizing the room feels like a walk-in freezer. She looks over at the massive stone fireplace and notices that the hearth is completely empty and unlit. She asks him if he is completely immune to the freezing temperatures, but Ulrich just smiles and tells her that he feels the cold perfectly. He explains that his body has simply adapted to the harsh climate over his 14 centuries of existence, meaning he just does not feel the need to show discomfort. Roberta looks at the towering stacks of old, dusty ledgers lining his desk, the silence in the room growing heavy. Ulrich removes his reading glasses, his dark eyes locking onto her with absolute clarity. He tells her to go ahead and speak her mind, knowing she did not freeze her way down the corridor just to check on his heating situation. Roberta clenches her hands, taking a deep breath before confessing that she had a lingering premonition during their journey. She swallows hard, the words catching in her throat before she finally lets them out. She asks him directly, "Are you planning to leave Dithmarschen?" We see a montage of footprints in the snow, representing the countless aliases he has discarded over the centuries, from Laurent to Oscar. Ulrich looks at her with a calm, quiet expression and simply replies that yes, it is about time. Roberta is completely stunned, but Ulrich just looks back at her and asks how long she honestly expected him to stay here. He explains the reality of his position, revealing that the only reason he ever became the Lord of Dithmarschen was to fulfill a promise to Hild. She begged him on her deathbed to protect her people from the brutal, freezing blizzards of the Little Ice Age. But now, the global temperatures are rising every single year, and the winters are growing significantly shorter. The Little Ice Age is officially drawing to a close, and the nomads of Dithmarschen are fully capable of surviving on their own. His promise to a dying friend has been completely fulfilled, meaning there is no longer a logical reason for him to stay. Roberta looks at him with a mixture of sadness and confusion, asking if he has truly developed no personal attachment to this land after 300 years. Ulrich quietly admits that of course he has grown attached, but that is exactly where the tragedy of immortality lies. He references Valenrio's bitter realization that his own descendants felt more distant to him than complete strangers. He asks Roberta to imagine a hypothetical scenario where he had a beloved friend named Ava. Before she died, she asked him to care for her child, so Ulrich raised that child with the utmost dedication and warmth. But then that child grew old and had their own children, and the cycle continued down through 5 or 6 generations. Eventually, the bloodline dilutes so much that he can no longer see a single trace of his original friend in them. At that point, staying by their side simply because they are her descendants becomes a form of emotional punishment. Roberta stands silent, her eyes downcast as she processes the immense, lonely weight of his words. She realizes the contrast. The white dragon chose to leave behind his family because he felt absolutely nothing, while Ulrich is forced to leave because he feels far too much. She looks into his eyes and realizes that our guy is essentially like burnt-out ash, having grown completely numb to the cycle of grief. She asks him the logical next question. Who is going to rule Dithmarschen once he vanishes? Ulrich doesn't hesitate, calmly writing a name down on his parchment, Bern. Roberta is shocked, asking if his colossal, dark-skinned guardian is secretly his biological descendant. Ulrich laughs softly, clarifying that they are not related by blood, as Hildy was sterile and could never bear children. The modern Hilderson clan actually carries the blood of Hildy's relatives and the various adopted orphans she took in. Bern belongs to the House of Meyer, who are descendants of Hohenlohe, the eldest of Hildy's adopted children. For generations, the family has been sending their children to serve Ulrich, desperately trying to keep him attached to this castle, but he is choosing Bern simply because Bern has the capability to lead. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots echoes outside the door. Roberta spins around in a comedic panic as a loud knock rattles the frame. Ulrich tells the visitor to come in, while Roberta internally screams, praying the giant guardian didn't just hear them planning his promotion. The massive door creaks open, and Bern's towering frame steps into the dim candlelight. He greets his lord with his usual polite, gentle smile, completely unfazed by the late hour. Roberta is sweat-dropping, keeping her eyes glued to the floor as she tries to act natural. Ulrich looks up, noting that his guardian is usually a solitary worker, so seeing him with a companion is rare. Bern steps aside, gesturing for a small figure standing in his massive shadow to step forward. He introduces a young, dark-skinned boy with messy black hair and striking red eyes named Fritz. Fritz is the fourth son of Bern's younger brother, and Bern has decided that it is time to start training him as his successor. Ulrich looks at the small boy, a faint melancholic smile crossing his face as he realizes how fast the years are slipping by. Bern looks down, his red eyes filled with a quiet, devastating loyalty as he promises that even when he is gone, his family will remain by Ulrich's side. Roberta watches the interaction, a wave of profound realization hitting her. For centuries, the nomadic people of this harsh land have been trying to bind this ageless man to their soil through pure, unconditional love. They kept offering their children, generation after generation, desperately hoping to give him a reason to stay. And she realizes that she was no different, secretly wishing he would remain their eternal guardian. But despite all their collective efforts, the ash has cooled, and he will soon leave Dithmarschen behind. Ulrich quietly folds his parchment, placing it into a leather pouch before looking up at Roberta. He casually sips his tea and asks, "Would you like to come with me?" Roberta's brain completely short-circuits, and she lets out a dramatic, comedic cough, spitting her tea across the table. She points a trembling finger at herself, her eyes wide with absolute sweat-drop disbelief. Chapter 16. We transition to the next morning, where Roberta is staring at a heavy white envelope sealed with a royal wax crest. Bern is serving breakfast while Ulrich calmly reads the letter, announcing that the Crown Princess of Osnover is having a royal wedding. Roberta, currently stuffed with a bagel, asks who the lucky groom is, and Ulrich reveals it is the eldest son of the Marquis of Quell. He explains the political landscape, noting that since the devastating civil war only recently ended, the royal family is trying to stabilize their power by marrying within the country. Roberta looks thoughtful, realizing that behind the glitz and glamour of a royal wedding lies a massive web of political survival. Here is the raw history of the Osnover kingdom. Just 5 years ago, the entire nation was locked in the teeth of a brutal civil war. The conflict originally erupted after the tragic, suspicious death of the crown prince, triggering a massive, bloody power struggle among the royal siblings. Near the end of this exhausting 32-year conflict, a ruthless, ambitious warlord stood at the very front, hiring foreign mercenaries to crush the noble houses. But just as he was about to claim the ultimate victory, he made the fatal mistake of launching a sudden invasion of Dithmarschen. He expected an easy victory over a barren northern territory, but our guy Ulrich was waiting for him, and the entire invasion force was utterly obliterated in the snow. With the rebel faction crushed, the crown was officially handed over to the Hilderson clan, making them the absolute masters of the Osnover kingdom. Roberta processes this massive lore drop, asking if that means King Richard of Osnover belongs to the Hilderson family. Ulrich casually confirms this, noting that Richard is actually his adopted son, which is a pretty wild flex when you think about it. Roberta looks at him with a sweat-dropped expression, asking if he is seriously planning to attend the wedding of his own adopted granddaughter. Ulrich sighs, admitting that he has no choice but to go because the letter contains a hidden message. King Richard is apparently dealing with a highly troublesome issue in the capital city of Eiselburg. The king didn't state the problem clearly to avoid interception, but it is clear he is facing a crisis he cannot resolve using normal royal power. Roberta smiles, teasing him that maybe his adopted son just wanted to see his ageless father's face after all these years. Ulrich ignores the teasing, looking at her over his teacup and repeating his invitation for her to join him. Roberta's face goes completely flat in a classic comedic reaction, her bagel hovering midair. She asks him if he is being serious, and Ulrich just dryly replies that he is always serious. He tells her that compared to scaling frozen mountains and fighting giant Arctic worms, a royal wedding will basically feel like a luxury vacation. Roberta tries to argue, stating that as the head priestess, she cannot simply abandon her parish to go on a royal road trip. Bern steps forward, carrying a beautifully wrapped royal blue scroll on a golden tray. Roberta's eyes narrow as she takes the scroll, a cold sweat breaking out on her forehead. She unfurls the parchment, her eyes widening as she reads the elegant flowing script. Stamped at the very bottom of the document is the official golden wax seal of the Holy Church's highest authority. Ulrich calmly sips his tea and explains that it is an official, temporary leave of absence signed directly by the Pope. The document explicitly states that the will of Ulrich is the will of the Church, commanding Roberta to assist him without a single delay. Roberta is completely hysterical, screaming at him to explain how a remote northern lord is casually exchanging letters with His Holiness. Ulrich just waves it off, treating the most powerful religious leader on the continent like a guy he casually plays League of Legends with on weekends. He tells her to pack her bags immediately because they are leaving at sunrise. Roberta walks out of the dining hall, completely defeated, internally screaming that she absolutely cannot handle this man. Later that afternoon, Bern approaches Ulrich in the quiet, sunlit study. He looks at his lord, his deep red eyes carrying a quiet, heavy sadness. He notes that after all these years, Ulrich is finally taking his leave of Dithmarschen. He confesses that having stayed by his side for so long, he always knew this day would eventually arrive. Ulrich looks up, telling his loyal guardian that there is absolutely nothing to fear. He has taught Bern everything he needs to know about administration and combat, and Bern is more suited to rule this land than anyone else. Bern looks down, his massive hands clenching as he admits that he can never truly fill the massive void Ulrich is leaving behind. He asks how anyone could ever dare to replace a legendary figure of his magnitude. We see a high-angle shot of Bern standing in the massive shadow of Ulrich's legacy, feeling incredibly small. Ulrich stands up, walking over to the towering giant. He reaches up, placing a warm, reassuring hand on Bern's massive shoulder. He looks up at his faithful friend and tells him that because it is Bern, he can leave Dithmarschen with absolute peace of mind. Bern's voice cracks with emotion, and he asks if Ulrich would have stayed if he had been inadequate instead. Ulrich let out a soft laugh, telling him that if he had been bad at his job, Ulrich would have simply found someone else to replace him. Bern smiles through his tears, realizing his lord's practical, unsentimental nature hasn't changed a bit, and he makes one final request. He pulls young Fritz forward, asking Ulrich to take the boy with him on his long journey. He explains that the House of Meyer is raised to believe that serving Ulrich is their life's sole purpose. If the master they are meant to serve suddenly vanishes, it will leave the young child completely lost and confused. Ulrich looks at Fritz, and for a split second, the image of a young, helpless Hild flashes in his mind. He remembers how Hilde was forced to inherit her title at a vulnerable age, surrounded by greedy, predatory relatives who wanted to steal her power. He reaches down, his expression softening as he accepts the request. He takes Fritz's small hand in his own, telling him, "Let's go together." The next morning, the sky is a brilliant, clear blue as our travelers set off on horseback. Roberta rides alongside Ulrich and Fritz, looking back at the towering white castle of Dithmarschen. Ulrich halts his horse at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the nomadic settlement one last time. He remembers the day he first arrived in this territory, back when the snow was piled as high as his head. He remembers Hild, standing in the courtyard with her beautiful dark hair blowing in the freezing wind. He remembers her warm, gentle smile and how she danced in the snow before the cold finally took her away. He takes a deep breath of the warm summer air, his expression turning resolute. He quietly whispers, "We shall go." With that, they turn their horses away from the north, riding down the mountain path toward the majestic capital city of Eiselburg. Roberta is completely baffled by their travel map, pointing out that major national events usually happen in Solna, where the Grand Temple is located, but King Richard moved the capital to Eiselburg simply because he absolutely detests priests playing backseat driver to his administration. Since Dithmarschen and Eiselburg are on completely opposite sides of the sandbox map, this journey is going to take several weeks. And that is exactly why they have to take a shortcut through a dense, sunlit woodland known as the Snow Forest, which currently looks way too green and vibrant to deserve such a freezing name. Roberta looks up at the massive green canopy, the warm summer breeze brushing against her face. Ulrich explains that it earned its name centuries ago when Dithmarschen was still physically connected to the Ice Peninsula. Back then, the entire territory was a frozen wasteland and snow elves used to live here in massive numbers. Fritz asks if they all vanished, and Ulrich explains that they had to leave. For a snow elf to live in a warm forest would be just as painful as a regular human trying to survive in the polar wastes, so they naturally migrated north as the global temperatures rose. Roberta asks him if he actually knows the way through this massive green maze, and Ulrich casually confirms he does. Fritz asks when he was last here, and Ulrich thinks for a second before muttering that it was probably about 80 years ago, which instantly earns him a sweat-dropped look of utter disbelief from Roberta. He explains that back then, this entire region belonged to the county of Goten, and he used to hunt mutated monsters alongside the local lords. He remembers a small village situated just outside the forest borders where they should be able to rest tomorrow. Roberta looks at him, realizing the absolute dizzying scale of his existence. An 80-year gap is a literal lifetime for a mortal, but to this man, it is just a brief memory of a weekend hunting trip. After spending a quiet, peaceful night camping under the stars, they finally arrive at the outskirts of the wooden village the following afternoon. They approach the heavy timber gates, but the atmosphere is incredibly tense. Suddenly, a heavy crossbow bolt splits the air, slamming into the dirt right in front of Ulrich's horse. A female guard on the watchtower aims her weapon directly at them, screaming for them to freeze. She demands that they state their business before taking another step. Fritz panics, but Roberta quickly steps forward to de-escalate the situation. She raises her hands in peace, calling out to the guard in a calm, authoritative voice. She introduces herself as a priestess of Ganymede, explaining that they are merely peaceful travelers seeking a safe place to rest for the night. The guard's eyes go wide, her hostile posture instantly melting when she sees Roberta's sacred vestments. The heavy gates slowly creak open, and the guard bows deeply, begging for forgiveness. She explains that travelers almost never pass through the dangerous snow forest, so she assumed they were bandits. Roberta smiles, telling her there is no need to apologize, and asks if they can secure a room. The guard is incredibly humble, worried that their simple village is too rundown to properly host a holy priestess. She offers to personally escort them to the village chief's house to ensure they are comfortable. As they walk down the dirt path, the local villagers peek over their fences, whispering in absolute awe. They look at the travelers like they are rare legendary drops in an MMO. Roberta remarks on how peaceful and welcoming the community feels, but Ulrich's expression remains quiet and introspective. He notes that this place has rebuilt beautifully considering it was a total disaster zone the first time he came here. Here is the harsh reality of this world. Normally, mutated monsters hide in desolate ruins and wait for travelers, but occasionally they develop a taste for slaughter and launch organized massive attacks on human settlements. Because these monsters possess absolutely no fear and rely on pure crushing brute force, it is incredibly common for entire towns to be wiped off the map. Roberta remembers visiting a similar war-torn disaster zone in her youth with Father Alonso, describing it as a literal blood-slicked hell. She looks at the thriving crops and happy children, genuinely amazed that the survivors managed to rebuild everything. Ulrich smiles faintly, agreeing that humanity's resilience is indeed a beautiful thing. They arrive at a large, sturdy wooden cabin at the center of the village. The guard knocks on the door, excitedly calling out for the chief. An elderly, frail man sitting in a wooden rocking chair slowly turns his head. His eyes are cloudy with cataracts, and his hands tremble as he rests them on his walking cane. The guard explains that a holy priestess and her traveling companions have arrived. The old chief slowly stands up, leaning heavily on his cane, apologizing for his humble home. He introduces himself as Chief Lumen, welcoming them with a warm, wrinkled smile. Roberta bows politely, thanking him for his hospitality. Lumen gestures toward a spare room down the hall, telling them to make themselves comfortable. The guard smiles, guiding Roberta and Fritz toward their quarters. But as Lumen turns to follow them, his cloudy eyes suddenly lock onto Ulrich's face. The old man freezes, his entire body starting to tremble. His eyes open wide in sheer, absolute shock, his breath catching in his throat. His voice shakes violently as he whispers, Lord, Ulrich. Ulrich stops, turning his head to look at the weeping old man. A soft, melancholic recognition enters his dark eyes as he realizes Lumen is the little boy he rescued 80 years ago. A memory of a burning camp under a blood-red sky flashes in the dark. Chapter 18. 80 years ago. A young Lumen is running through a pitch-black forest, his chest heaving as he carries his bleeding little sister on his back. The neighboring Goten territory had been completely destroyed by a rogue monster, and every nearby village was wiped out in a single afternoon. The young boy's face is covered in soot and tears, his legs burning as he runs from the carnage. His entire world has been completely erased. He remembers seeing his father's lifeless body lying in a pool of dark blood back at their home. He squeezed his eyes shut, desperately crying out to the silent forest, praying for anyone to save them. He kept running through the freezing night, his sister's weight dragging him down. Suddenly, the trees behind them explode as a massive, shadow-like shape lunges forward. It is a colossal, mutated boar monster with razor-sharp tusks and glowing red eyes, its jaw dripping with saliva. The young boy trips, falling hard into the dirt as the beast opens its massive jaws to crush them. He curls his body over his sister, bracing himself for the physical impact of those giant fangs. He lets out a terrified scream, tears streaming down his face as death looms over them. Ulrich drops from the trees. Steel flashes, the air splits, and the giant boar is sliced clean in half before it can even touch the children. The beast crashes into the snow, completely dead, while the young boy stares up at his ageless savior in utter awe. Back in the present, Lumen grips his cane, his eyes welling with tears as he confirms that yes, Ulrich was the one who saved them. Roberta asks about his sister, and Lumen reveals that thanks to the priest Ulrich sent to heal her wounds, she lived a long, healthy life before passing away of old age. He looks down, a bitter smile on his face as he notes that he is now the very last survivor of that terrible day. Even though only 11 people from their original village survived the massacre, Ulrich personally relocated refugees from other war-torn areas here, helping the community get back on its feet. Lumen explains that they always wanted to pay him back, even sending massive carriages of fresh crops as a tribute to Dithmarschen. But Ulrich's expression remains completely flat as he dryly asks Lumen if he truly believes such material things held any meaning to an ageless entity. Lumen chuckles softly, remembering how Ulrich sent the carriages back every single time, often packed with even more food and supplies than they had originally sent. They tried to visit him in person to say thank you, but by then, Ulrich had already entered one of his deep, decade-long hibernation sleeps. The old chief begins to weep, his shoulders shaking with silent, heavy grief. He believed he would go to his grave without ever seeing his savior again, but standing before him today, looking exactly the same as he did 80 years ago, is Lord Ulrich. Lumen reaches out with his wrinkled, trembling hands, grasping Ulrich's wrist with absolute, overwhelming gratitude. He begs his lord to stay for a few days so the village can host a grand feast, but Ulrich politely declines, stating they are on a tight schedule. Meanwhile, Roberta is inside a small cabin, checking on a sick child as a worried mother looks on. She asks why the local priests from the Goten County haven't arrived, noting that the deadline for the child's infant sacrament has long passed. She looks out the window, her expression darkening as she realizes there are several unbaptized babies in this village, and many of them are starting to show signs of a strange, magical illness. Realizing they cannot leave these children unprotected, the party decides to delay their departure for half a day so Roberta can perform the protective sacraments. The next morning, the villagers gather at the wooden gates to see them off. Lumen looks at Ulrich, his voice filled with reverence as he states that every child playing in this dirt is living proof of his ancient grace. He promises that they will write Ulrich's deeds into their historical records so future generations will never forget what he did for them. But Ulrich's face goes completely serious, his voice dropping to a firm, quiet tone. He tells Lumen, "Do not do that." He explains, "I merely caught you once when you were about to fall off a cliff. Climbing back up was your own choice, and building this thriving community was your own strength. Do not be bound to my memory." Lumen's eyes widen, the heavy weight of Ulrich's wisdom hitting him. Our guy wants them to take pride in their own survival rather than turning him into a god to be worshipped. Lumen bows his head, promising to keep his words in his heart as the villagers wave goodbye. As they ride down the dirt path, Roberta asks him why he chose to stop by this specific village if he didn't want their gratitude. Ulrich smiles faintly, admitting that whenever he thinks about the people he saved, he gets a little curious to see how they are doing. He asks Roberta if she remembers the ancient ruined tower they saw on the Ice Peninsula. She nods, recalling the bleak, tragic inscription carved into the stone, "We are now dying." Ulrich looks out over the golden fields, revealing there was a second line to that engraving that he didn't translate earlier. "Even if we die, we are never defeated." Roberta looks at him, her heart swelling with a deep, profound respect. She realizes that after living for 14 centuries, every single dirt path they travel on is a physical journey through this man's ageless memories. They soon arrive at the bustling gates of Tenoff City, a major trading hub where they plan to resupply before making the final push to the capital. Roberta stretches her arms, glad to finally see a normal market after weeks of traveling through the wild. But their peaceful arrival is shattered by the sound of furious screaming. A burly, angry merchant is violently whipping a young, light brown horse, screaming at the poor animal to stay still. Roberta's eyes suddenly freeze, her entire body going completely stiff. Her high-strung theological brain completely short-circuits as she senses a massive, impossible glitch in the Matrix. Why am I sensing pure human mana radiating from inside that horse?